Good evening, everyone. This is the Finance Committee Home Edition, June 10th, 2020. This meeting is being recorded and televised. I wanted to start off tonight's meeting by just acknowledging a few items that are probably going to become more engaging as we go along here. That first and foremost, we've seen in both social media and conversations that there's some discussion around attending tonight's meeting. Additional conversation, additional discussion needed. So I want to thank everyone that's attending. I want to thank everyone that's planning on attending. I think that broadening the engagement and the discussion of any subject in town is obviously a good thing. Obviously, we've all seen the very seismic shift over the last few weeks of the country since the murder of George Floyd and all the subsequent protests and demonstrations and potentially consciousness awakening pieces that have been happening in the country since then. So I think it's good to have more attendance and more engagement in this as we go along. I will say this though, obviously just to sort of level set a little bit. As we move through this, my goal is twofold tonight. I think the goal of the entire board is twofold tonight. To first and foremost, obviously get through the warrant articles that we have in front of us, to discuss them, deliberate on them, vote on them, bring some additional attention, additional information about them out, so that the voters of Easton have a better understanding of exactly what's in them, what they mean, what they do. But also I want to give an opportunity for people to ask questions about those warrant articles. It's actually kind of interesting in this current context that when we set this up, when we published the agenda for this meeting, this was not something that was planned or something that was on our minds, but we did not include a public comment aspect. It's not really even an oversight. This is typically a relatively straightforward housekeeping meeting, to use the term. But because of the fact that it's not on the agenda and because of open meeting law rules, we want to make sure that we do two things. We have people that want to ask questions can absolutely ask questions. They can submit those questions to us. In this case, it's going to be a Q&A format via this webinar, which I will explain exactly some of the parameters of that right now. But I also want to make sure that we understand that they do have to be in some way, shape, or form associated with the warrant articles themselves. So this is, as an advisory body of the town, we don't set policy. We're not in a position to actually put out policy decisions or make policy ourselves. We are specifically set up to go through municipal questions that are brought to us from the town to give our recommendations on them. So we want to make sure that we're not limiting any public comment or public engagement because of that. We want to still welcome questions and welcome engagement from the public, because I think that the more questions that people ask, the more engagement that we have, the more informed the voters of Easton are and the better off everyone is. But I'm going to read one piece of the meeting itself so that everyone's on the same page as to how this is going to go. So in order to ask a question, we're going to need name, address, and I'm going to ask for the warrant article number along with your question, just so we are able to discern exactly which ones you're speaking about. The way this works, and I'll read this specifically so we're all on the same page, like I said, for general meetings, not hearings, and only for items under which the chair solicits public comment, members of the public participating in the Zoom meeting may submit a written question via text chat, provided they include their full name and address for the public record. The chair reserves the right to discard comments submitted that are off topic or do not include name and address. Members of the public viewing the meeting on ECAT may submit questions in writing via email to mblanchard@easton.ma.us. The chair reserves the right to respond to questions during the live meeting, but may limit the time for such activities. Any questions not addressed in the meeting may be answered afterwards via email and will be incorporated into the minutes of the meeting for the public record. So, obviously, we're happy to have the additional attendees. We're happy to dive into this and answer questions as they come up. Without further ado, we're going to get into the various different articles at hand. When we get to an article that is something that someone has a question on, please feel free to submit that question at that time. Again, just let us know which number, just in case if it's something that you came in a little later, you didn't have a chance to submit it at the proper time. Still feel free, and we will read the article itself. We will deliberate, discuss, ask questions of our finance director and town administrator, and then use that to better our conversation about voting. Are there any questions from the finance committee before we get started? Anything that we want to speak to as a measure? Yes, Roberta.
I just want to check in and make sure, how do you want us to proceed with our own questions? Will you recognize just by a hand, Mr. Chairman?
I hadn't thought of that. That's probably the easiest way to go. My thought was just from a process standpoint as well to effectively to read, open the floor from our comments and our discussion, and then open it to whatever questions have been submitted via the Zoom, if that makes sense. And yes, a raised hand. I mean, I don't think we're all going to talk over each other, so raised hand's fine, and I can recognize at that point. Excellent.
Patrick.
Right. Yes.
Jeremy, with a question. When we vote, are we going to be voting in any specific order? I know other committees go alphabetically or something like that. Do we have anything?
My plan was just to go right down the list numerically, just 1 to 11.
No, I mean, as far as when we're...
Oh, you mean us internally,
yeah.
our humans.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought of it. I actually, you know what I'll do? I'll call out, because I have a list on the right-hand side of I think when everyone's joined. So I'll call names out and ask for your vote at that time. If anyone's not familiar, it's, and Connor, keep me honest here, it's last name and your vote. Is that correct?
That's correct. All votes, because we're remote, should be done by roll call. So you your last name and your yes or no, or whichever.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, good question, Jeremy. I will run down the list and ask for people to vote via roll call.
All right, thank you.
Anyone else? Excellent. All right. So starting off, Article 1. Amend revolving fund bylaw to establish fire/EMS vehicle and equipment revolving fund and establish spending limits for revolving funds. To see if the town will vote to amend Chapter 26-6 Department Revolving Funds, Section E, authorized revolving fund of the Chapter 26 Financial Affairs bylaw of the Town of Easton General Bylaws by adding an additional revolving fund to the table as follows. Revolving account is fire, EMS vehicle, and equipment revolving fund. Spending authority is fire and rescue department. Revenue source is funds received in connection with the sale of surplus fire, EMS vehicles, and equipment. The allowed expenses is purchase of new or used vehicles and equipment, or supplemental funding for the purchase of new or used vehicles and equipment for fiscal year 2021 and subsequent years. And also to see if the town will vote to authorize the total expenditures for the following resolvent funds pursuant to GLC 44, Section 53E and a half for the fiscal year beginning July 1st, 2020, to be expended in accordance with said bylaws. And I'm not going to read down this entire list of the various different expenditures. We obviously all have this, or take any other action relative to. Explanation. This article amends the bylaw to add an additional revolving fund for the fire and rescue department and sets the annual spending limits for all revolving funds established pursuant to Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 44, Section 53E and a half. Actual expenditures cannot exceed the balance in the fund, even if the expenditures are less than the established limits. I now open it to discussion and questions. Tim.
Yeah, Connor, it's my understanding that other departments have the revolving fund as well. I believe is it DPW, water, and police all have revolving fund?
I'm sorry, Tim, could you repeat the question?
The other departments that have revolving funds, do you know them offhand? I believe it was.
So you have the new one being established in this is a revolving fund for the fire EMS department related to just repair and maintenance of vehicles, using a revenue source of the disposition of excess or surplus supplies, which is comparable to police and DPW.
Very well, thank you.
I'd just also like to add that that those revolving funds are part of this article. They're part of those annual amounts that are authorized that Patrick alluded to, but just didn't list specifically. These limits are all the same as they were last year, with the exception of the town clerk for records preservation. That number has been increased from 10,000 to 20,000 to allow for additional spending. Usually the revenue is about 10,000 a year, but if it doesn't, if it's not all spent, the balance will roll forward to the following year. So this will just allow for additional spending, which is going to be needed in her department next year, and well, in a lot of departments, because we're going to be leaning probably more on revolving funds if that's available to a particular department, because the budgets are going to be a lot leaner next year.
Jeremy, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, so the revenue sources, the funds received in connection with the sale of surplus vehicles, where does that money currently go now?
That would just go into the general fund.
Okay, so is that going to have any negative impact on our budget? Does that money normally go, back to fire and EMS, or is there a chance that this money is going to be pulling from another part of our budget and affecting a different department?
Well, typically when the surplus sale is made, that money would go into the general fund. It would become part of free cash. But that's not a type of revenue that we would typically budget for. So this way, the money will go back to that department to be used for equipment.
Okay, so our free cash won't receive this money anymore. So it will have an impact, but it's not something we consider, part of our operating budget in that sense of budgeting.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Roberta, did you have something?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Wendy and Connor, do we see this over the course of the year? Do we see the progression as we progress toward that cap of the expenditure?
So that you would see it on like in the revolving fund reports, which will break out like the beginning balance, the revenues for the year, and then what's been spent, and then the balance.
Got it. So the FinCom does have the ability, as does the town, to just monitor and make sure that we're staying within that limit. Thank you.
Yes. Yep.
Any other committee member questions? We do have one question from the attendees. All right, I'll read this out. I assume this is probably either Wendy or Connor. Hannah 2, I apologize if I'm pronouncing your last name wrong. 148 Randall Street. What do police cruiser detail fees entail?
So I can take that. So, so we have a police detail account that we, people request a detail. They pay for that separately. It doesn't come out of a town operating budget. And we pay for the payroll out of that account. If a particular organization requests that it's not just a police officer that comes, but also comes with a cruiser, there would be an additional fee for that, and that fee would go into that particular revolving account.
Thank you. Any other questions, or comments from board, or any other questions from attendees? Seeing none, I don't think I see any. I will ask for a motion.
So moved.
Can I have a second?
Second.
All those in favor of approval of Article 1, please say so when I read you from roll. Let's go down the list here. Jennifer Stacy.
Yes.
Jeremy Tamelio.
Yes.
Mike DePietro.
Yes.
Roberta Verville.
Yes.
Jamie Stebbins.
Stebbins, yes.
Oh, yeah, actually, I apologize. Did everyone use their last name?
I did not. Also, for the record, do we need the motion and second to have their last names attached?
I don't understand the question.
As long as, I assume
Dave
Stacy is taking the minutes, as long as that's reflected in the minutes, who motioned and who seconded, that's fine.
Okay, thank you. This list keeps shifting. I'm going to go back up to the top, and please remember to say your last name and then yes or no, just so we have this set up correctly. Mike DePietro.
DePietro, yes.
Roberta.
Verville, yes.
Jennifer.
Stacy, yes.
Jeremy.
Tamelio, yes.
Davis.
Healy, yes.
Tim.
Famoso, yes.
Jamie.
Stebbins, yes.
And myself, Helen, yes. Okay, guys, we got through the first one.
Can I
Small
just
box.
ask, since we're video recording and we have our faces with our names and can see it, just curious if there's any way to do that without the process. If there is, great. If not, whatever. Let's move on.
I think roll call rules do require the name and the vote in either way. All right, so Article 2, elected officials' compensation. To see if the town will vote to fix the salary and compensation of all elected officers of the town as provided by Section 108 of Chapter 41 of the General Laws as follows. Select Board, each member, $1,800. Board of Health, each member, $1,000. Board of Assessors, each member, $1,800. Moderator, $100, or take any other action relative thereto. Explanation, this is an annual article required by statute to set the salary levels for all compensated elected officials. I open it to any questions, discussions, etc. Jeremy, I saw your hand raised.
Just to confirm, these are level from last year, correct?
Yes.
Thank you.
Roberta?
Same question. That's fine. Thank you.
Anyone else? Any discussions or any other questions? I see nothing from the audience on this one, so.
Move to recommend DePietro.
Second, Famosi.
Alrighty. I will go down my ever-changing list. Mike.
Petro, yes.
Roberta.
Burville, yes.
Jennifer.
Stacy, yes.
Davis.
Healy, yes.
Jamie.
Stebbins, yes.
Jeremy.
Melio, yes.
Tim.
Famosi, yes.
And myself, Helen, yes. Did I miss anybody? I don't think so. I'm gonna make my own master list so I don't have to rely on this thing shifting its entire list every 5 seconds. So I'm not gonna be in this position anymore. While I do that, could someone read Article 3? Anyone have any volunteers?
I can do that, Patrick.
Thank you, Davis.
All right, so Article 3 is titled Appropriation and Authorization to Expend Chapter 90 Funds, to see if the town will vote to appropriate a sum of money to be expended in anticipation of the reimbursement authorized for the state's share of the cost of work to be done under Chapter 90 of the General Laws, or to take any other action relative thereto. By way of explanation, this is the town's annual share of Chapter 90 funds provided by the state for road-related improvements in the community.
Questions, comments, discussion? Connor.
Just for the committee's edification, this is a placeholder we normally have on every annual town meeting warrant, but Wendy, correct me if I'm wrong, we don't actually know what our appropriation will be next year.
We don't.
Much like we don't know much at all about state funding appropriations in general, to the dismay of all of us. So we are not asking or seeking a recommendation at this time because we don't know what that number is.
So we can move, do we have to do a motion to move past 3 or do we just not vote on it?
You can just simply take no action.
Okay. Davis,
Can I ask a question on that?
Yes, Jeremy, go ahead.
Sorry, Temelio, why did the select board recommend it, but we're not voting on it?
It's not listed with a recommendation by the select board on my warrant. I don't know if I'm working.
I'm on the link that you sent us.
Yeah, I have a recommend on mine as well.
Oh,
Yes,
I'm sorry, that was the wrong article. I think we anticipated
having one.
that we would have the information. I think now we're going to move to dismiss it. Under all normal circumstances, no one would vote not to recommend the Chapter 90 funding because it is a special revenue category that can only be used for road work. So there would be no reason usually to vote not to use that money for the roads. It can't be used for anything else. But I had only talked to Wendy about that today, which led to me saying we don't need action.
Stacy, quick question to follow up on that. When it does come in, do we have to approve that at that point in time, or what's the process around that?
Town council actually told us that it's technically not even necessary to do this. We've been doing this for years. A lot of communities that our council serves in as well, they also do it, but he said it's technically not required. So I'm really inclined to going forward, just not even including it because it's not necessary.
And essentially that's the, not to jump ahead, but that's essentially the same, it's the same discussion for Article 4, correct? Where it's the, and I'll read it just to have it, but Article 4, supplement fiscal year 2020 budgets to see if the town will vote to raise and appropriate or appropriate by transfer from available funds a sum of money to supplement fiscal year 2020 budgets or take any other action relative thereto. This article is a placeholder at the current time, will be updated if supplements to fiscal year 2020 budgets are necessary or otherwise be removed from the warrant.
So that's another placeholder article. We do anticipate that there will be some adjustments to fiscal 20 budgets, I think, to the trash account out of revenue available, but we're still doing the accounting for that. So we're not pulling that from a warrant at this time, but we're going to be basically counting the pennies up till town meeting, and we'll have that information then.
So no action necessary tonight on this one, is it?
No, I would like to add though that I would at this point in the year, we're so close to the end of the fiscal year. There's $46,521 left in the reserve fund. So I would make a recommendation that we use that reserve fund as a funding source for any departments in the general fund that need supplemental funding. And I anticipate that it's probably going to be less than 20,000 for the general fund.
Can we clarify, when you say reserve fund, you're talking about the receipts reserve, the reserve fund from a trash enterprise account, yes?
No, I mean the finance committee reserve fund.
Okay, sorry, thank you. From the finance.
Yeah, the trash, what we need for the trash budget will come from solid waste and recycling surplus. So it'll come from the enterprise fund, but anything that's gonna come out of the general fund, I know the town clerk is going to need a budget supplement and maybe 3,500 in other general government.
Tim?
Wendy, have there been any emergency requisitions from any of the departments in regards to that fund? I know we used it in the past for that.
I believe there were 2 transfers made this year so far. There was one initially from the town clerk, which was for the school funding for the special town meeting that we had for that, the special election. And then there was also additional funding for the fire department for vehicle repair and maintenance. I think that was like 25,000.
And there's no other pending requests for emergency requisition?
Nope.
Thank you.
So correct me if I'm wrong. One question on this is that if this is something where, will there be a warrant article for that transfer, or do we just make do we just vote on that supplemental transfer of money from our own reserve fund in that case?
We were so close to town meeting. I would just put it in this article and use the reserve fund as a funding source.
Okay.
But that, like, from a technical perspective, Wendy, that can be effectuated just by virtue of the language in the motion read the night of town meeting, right?
Yes.
Okay. The placeholder still, night of town meeting, we can make that motion official and get the town to vote on it.
Yes. I mean, I think if we only needed transfers for general fund budgets and we didn't need an extra article, then you know, coming to you for the reserve fund transfer would probably be the way to go. But in this case, we're close to town meeting. We're going to need the article anyway for the trash budget. So it just makes sense to include everything here.
So this is one of the ones where typically we have a similar to this, a last minute final sort of house cleaning association meeting that's right before town meeting to make sure that we have discussed and recommended or not recommended the remainder. This would be one of them that we would have the opportunity to do that on the night of town meeting, I assume.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Okay. Article 5, supplement fiscal year 2020 capital budget. To see if the town will vote to appropriate by transfer from available funds the sum of $54,500 to supplement the capital budget needs of the town for fiscal year 2020 or take any other action relative thereto. Mouse isn't working. Explanation: at the special town meeting in November 2019, funding of the $132,300 was approved for the purchase of 3 Dodge Charger police cruisers. However, the police department was later notified after the town meeting that those vehicles will not be available until the fall 2020. As a result, the department purchased different vehicles, but the appropriation was only sufficient to purchase 2 vehicles rather than 3. This article will transfer the balance remaining in the original appropriation of approximately $23,000 plus surplus funds and another appropriation to make up the difference to purchase the 3rd police cruiser.
Yes. Every year in the capital budget, there's a request. It's part of our annual ongoing fleet maintenance to replace police cruisers on a routine basis. We typically will fund 3 police cruisers every year. Last year at the fall town meeting, we approved the 3, but we ended up going with a different model. There was not enough funds in that appropriation to buy 3, so we did buy 2. And the capital planning committee was made aware of this, and they, made the recommendation to go with the change in the type of vehicle. And so basically, we're using what's left over in that original appropriation. There was money left over in an appropriation to purchase cruisers from the previous October of 2018 town meeting, and that's where that other money is coming from. So it's a combination of 23,000 from the original article and 31,500 from the other article to purchase 3 police cruisers. Any other questions on that?
Questions, comments from the committee? Davis.
So basically, given that this was budgeted for, but it wasn't spent because the sum wasn't enough, if the town were to vote no on this warrant article, what would become of the money that had been budgeted towards this but would not be spent as a result of the article being denied?
It could either be closed out at the end of the fiscal year, or it could be carried forward and later used as a funding source at a later town meeting. But the only way to spend it, if you don't close it out, would be a town meeting vote.
Okay, and just as a technical question, would that money, would it go into the general fund, or would it remain on the books as being for this item?
If it was closed out, it would just go into the general fund because it was funded from available funds. We always try, because this is an annual routine recurring article, we always try to fund it from some type of available funds, whether it's free cash or some other source of funding that is not borrowing.
Okay, thank you.
Jeremy, I saw your hand.
Yeah, so the original allocation was 132,300, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
They bought 2 vehicles. This sounds like a math problem. I apologize. They bought 2 vehicles. Were those vehicles more expensive than the ones they were purchasing or planning to purchase? And why was that upcharge done? I mean, we allocated them money, went to town meeting. That's what we as a town voted for. I think my gut reaction is that it's a little inappropriate to incentivize the purchase of more expensive vehicles by giving them another, basically, 40% premium. And I understand that it was out of their control, but I mean, that's a substantial amount of money in a time where we're cutting so much from every single department. So the question in a boiled down version is why were these vehicles more expensive, and what happens if we don't fund this 3rd vehicle, considering they already bought 2 more?
Well, first of all, if you don't fund it, then they won't buy it.
Is there any reason to believe that would have a substantial effect on their response times or any community facing things?
So just to be clear, as far as the purchase of 2 versus 3 or a premium paid, the 3 vehicles is the annual replacement of part of a fleet management system that's comparable to the planning that we put in place for the fire department and for public works and for the water division to try to maintain our capital assets at a rate that they're not degrading to the point where it costs us more money repairs and maintenance for older vehicles than not. The three vehicles is the standard request annually that goes through the capital planning committee, and you are correct, is voted on by voters, including the capital planning committee. And because this was something that happened outside of control, this did go back to capital planning, who recommended that it proceed in that way. So reducing it or not moving forward with the transfer of this from an existing appropriation for the same department would basically, you would just be purposefully not adhering to your capital replacement schedule. And as far as to the question of other budgets that are struggling, as they all are, that's part of why when you get later in this warrant, you look at the capital budget for fiscal 21, that's been stripped down really, really, really dramatically to basically critical emergency apparatus like an ambulance and funding for PFAS design for our water supply.
Yep, I thank you for both Wendy and Connor's explanation, but I would like a little clarification on, I know I asked a lot of questions, so I do apologize, but I would like a little clarification on why the alternative cruiser was so expensive. Were we not able to get, a comparable, obviously we couldn't get that exact model, but that's a big upcharge for.
Right, it's a different kind, basically you're going from a Dodge Charger to an SUV.
Right.
So was there a legitimate policing purpose? I will, leave that ambiguous, I guess, to getting the SUV versus the Charger? I assume they serve different roles. Haven't never been a cop. I don't know. Do they have a different purpose? I'm just trying to get to the root of why we spent so much more money on two cars than we were planning on.
So those were purchased off of the state bid list, which is through a vendor that's certified by the Commonwealth for use by cities and towns and police departments. The answer to the cost differentials, it was a different model. It was what was available, and the alternative was 0 vehicles. So as far as their utility, they can be used for normal police operations, but obviously an SUV is slightly more flexible than a cruiser.
Thank you for the answer.
Jen.
Will a vehicle be taken offline and sold, or kind of what's the process with how this relates to other vehicles already in the fleet? And will that be, if it's sold, was that money going to the revolving fund for the police vehicle?
So typically that vehicle would either be traded in or it would be passed down to another department. There is no revolving fund for the police department for the sale of surplus equipment.
Jamie.
So I just want to comment too that when these decisions were made before we saw the auto industry as well as much industry in the US curtailed heavily, it was actually a very fortunate thing that we happened to get our hands on some vehicles that were available versus now. If we were to go and try and order vehicles now, we're looking at potentially like a 2-year wait period. And what's important for everyone to know is deferring the maintenance and keeping older vehicles and not doing this, non-reactive trade out of vehicles is very important because it saves us money, right? In the cost of maintenance over time. So I think it's important, and it's worked for many years, and we're very fortunate to be in the position we're in. Otherwise, again, we'd be looking at not being able to get vehicles. And we're going to find this is going to happen. So next year, or if we have a vehicle go down and completely out of service, we're going to find it very difficult to get vehicles to bring
online. Jeremy, is your hand raised, or is that just from before?
I'm sorry, it's from before. I'm bad at this.
No problem. Are there any other? I actually have one question, which I think was answered, but I might have missed it. And Wendy, correct me if I'm wrong. So if this is voted down at town meeting, this money at the end of the fiscal year would go back into the general fund. It's not something that's immediately available for reallocation at that time. Is that correct?
It could be closed out, or it could be carried forward. That's a discussion we would have internally to determine what we would do about that appropriation.
And so if it was closed out, that money could potentially be available for, again, reallocation back to the general fund and spending at that point.
It would just become part of the free cash certification if it got closed out.
Got it. Okay. That's what I want to make sure. All right. Jeremy, yes.
Sorry, just a quick question. How many vehicles does the police department have? I know it's probably a broad question, but do we have any even rough estimate?
No, I don't have that offhand.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, Mike?
And going back to the general fund, Wendy, is it correct to say that once there, it can be used for either capital or operational uses?
If it becomes part of free cash?
Right, it can go either way, right?
Yeah, free cash can be used for any purpose that you would appropriate money for.
Great. So I thought, just wanted to confirm.
To be clear though on that, free cash is part of one of two pieces of our reserves, right? And we try our best to limit the use of free cash for recurring costs like department budgets and personnel, because free cash doesn't recur, right? You're basically programming and obligating a recurring annual cost with one-time money if you do.
Right. It's a very sensible extreme bias towards using free cash for capital expenditures. Absolutely understand that. I was just curious if there were existing restrictions on it. Thank you.
Anyone else? Before I turn over, we have several questions from attendees. Davis, yes.
Sorry, just real quickly. I just pulled up the capital budget request that the police chief had made back in January. I think as long as these numbers are the most up to date, it looks like the total fleet is about 20 vehicles. Just to answer I think it was Jeremy's question earlier.
Thank you, Davis.
Yep.
Davis. Anything else?
That was it.
All right, so let me go to the Q&A from the attendees. There are several that are relatively similar in their asks. I'm going to try to combine some of these together to make sure we have a good answer for all. Andrew Abramson for Flint Lane. Given that between 2014 and 2018 in Easton, residents had less than a 0.1% chance of being a victim of violent crime, according to multiple sources, and less than a 1% chance of being a victim of any crime, would it not be more prudent for all of you to vote to not recommend funds for an additional police cruiser, so town meeting might potentially allocate those funds towards the reactive school budget? And on a similar note, from Hannah Toe to 148 Randall Street, given that the school is eliminating 16.75 full-time employees and eliminating $847,000 in proposed funding for fiscal 21, why are we funding more police cruisers when we could be using this money on a regressive school budget? I think there's a few that are in that same realm. So to that point, I guess if we boil that question down, the question becomes, and Wendy, Connor, I think this is obviously towards you. If we vote to not recommend, if at town meeting this is voted no, potentially what is the process to reallocate that to the school budget? Is that as cut and dry as it might seem on paper, or is it a process where that's again more voting, more association, more discussion as to how that money gets across to something like a school budget if needed?
Well, town meeting is free to vote to appropriate from available revenue sources as the voters see fit. The kind of academic question underneath there of why would we spend money on a capital item when we have operating budget needs is a fair one. And the reason was somewhat touched on by Jamie, that when we defer capital items because of operating challenges, which we already do, unfortunately, far too frequently because of a structural revenue problem we've had for 13 years now. It's not as clean cut as you save money over here, you move it here, and you're done. Those vehicles need to be used, and to tie it to the question regarding violent crime, whether the crime is violent or not, police do need vehicles to drive. So if you take funding from a capital source, and you could make this any capital source, and use one-time money in a recurring budget, it doesn't fix the underlying very legitimate, very severe revenue problem.
Tim?
I apologize for not having the number in front of me, but Wendy, maybe you do, or are able to access it. Do you have the repair budget for the police department on their last fiscal?
Can take a look at that.
Thank you. I guess the question I'm looking for is their repair budget meeting the need of keeping up with the repairs, or are they continually seeking to go over or meet that cap every year?
Okay, so last year the appropriation was 23,500 for repair and maintenance vehicles, and they spent just under 25,000. So they did spend more than what the appropriation was, by about just under $1,500.
And also to clarify, that's within the past few fiscal years, staying within that capital recommendation of 3 new cruisers a year, and we're still having difficulty keeping up with the repair of those vehicles.
Yeah, and I will also add too, I mean, you know, these vehicles, they put on a significant amount of mileage every year. A lot of these vehicles, when I look at the fleet inventory, we've got you know, 86,000 miles, 90,000 miles, 104,000 miles, and you know, yeah, maybe there are 20 or so vehicles in the department, but in terms of like the ones that are actually used for patrol, because you know, detectives have vehicles also, it's less, it's definitely less than that. And there's also a significant amount that, you know, the miles don't just tell the whole story, because these cruisers spend a lot of time just idling. So there's a lot more engine hours than these miles would indicate.
Thank you.
Jeremy?
Yeah, I apologize, Connor. I assume you put this in the memo, but I wasn't anticipating this question. Are we currently anticipating laying off any police officers in the next fiscal year? I don't know if it works on FTEs as well or that system, but any kind of reduction in staffing for patrol officers or uniformed officers?
Yes, like every budget on the school side and the town side, we have had to reduce the initial request for all of our departments. And this relates more to Article 7 than this one, but it's really important also to know that the budget still isn't even balanced, right? We still need to cut further, unfortunately, on the expense side. And so police department budget has already been reduced from the initial request, and it will be further in the next iteration of a budget on Monday, and there will be elimination of a full-time equivalent position in the department.
I apologize. I should have framed that better in context of this article. I was asking because if we're going to be cutting, you know, 1 FTE police officer, does it make sense that we would have, you know, we would be funding less patrol vehicles? So that was the framing for it. But you answered my question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else from the committee? We have, it's sort of on the same side. It makes a slightly different ask, which is, would it be possible to allocate this capital budget item towards other areas that are degrading, such as water, which contains dangerous levels of the chemical PFAS, instead of protecting a police cruiser? It's more of a nuance on the same answer, I think. I just want to make sure that I'm giving that specific ask a call out.
So to be clear, we are talking about supplementing the current year fiscal 20 capital budget. PFAS funding is an important priority for the town, we agree. And that's why it's in the other article on the same warrant. I think Article 8 is the capital budget for fiscal year 2021. And we will be funding the necessary design and engineering to begin scoping out treatment for townwide PFAS filtration. So that is happening. It's not an either or, they're both occurring. Just from a more accounting perspective, you know, the police department is operated out of the general fund. The water division is operated in what's called an enterprise fund. And the revenues that are derived from that come from water fees, right? We pay a rate for the amount of water we consume, the type of service you have. And so you fund water capital items typically out of those funds. And that is what we're doing. We will be doing that. They're not mutually exclusive.
Thank you, Connor. Davis, did you have something you wanted to add?
Connor got all of it.
That's wise. Town administrator. I saw Jamie, then Roberta, then Mike. Jamie, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to point out too, and we've had this comparison available for a long time. When you look at the Easton Police Department and its funding compared to comparison communities, which I'll mention in a moment, as well as our neighboring communities, we are significantly underfunded per capita. So to give you an idea, neighboring communities would be Sharon, West Bridgewater, Stoughton, Norton, Raynham, and we are over 34% less funded for the police department per capita than those communities. And then we look at some of the core communities that are very similar to the makeup of Easton: Mansfield, Foxborough, Marshfield, Ashland, Walpole, Canton, Chelmsford, Dedham. We're over 20% less funded than those communities per capita. So keep that in mind as we get ready to cut across all these departments, the tough decisions that all these department heads have to make. This is undoubtedly a very tough time. Couldn't have come at a worse time, right? We have all this happening, and right now to be putting public safety, at further jeopardy. It's just, we couldn't have come across a worse time. So I'm very sympathetic to all the thoughts about how do we spread the very limited amount of cash and this operating budget and trying to put it together. You don't wish it upon anyone. It's going to be a very, very difficult road over the next couple of weeks, and very difficult because we're all proud of this town and proud of the people who live here, and have a lot of respect for people's opinions. So it's going to be difficult, but people need to realize this is across all departments. Everyone's going to feel this pain. That's it.
Thank you, Jamie. Roberta, I believe you had your hand up.
Yeah, it just, I think I'm finding my own answer, but so did we say earlier, Connor, that we would not have 3 new vehicles in the coming capital budget?
The fiscal 21 capital budget in Article 8 is very limited. All other items that were requested to the Capital Planning Committee have been deferred until at least the fall. That will give the community and the Capital Planning Committee and all of us time to get a better grip on how bad, frankly, things are.
Good. Very good. Thank you.
Mike?
I think along those lines, let me share my thinking on this. Is there a way that we can defer this somewhat? And when I say sharing my thinking, what I mean is that Jeremy's point, I think, is a fairly strong one, as are some of the questions that are being asked about sort of where our priorities are and so forth, especially given the timing of so many things out there. By the same token, from a financial perspective, it's absolutely not lost on me the importance of using free cash for capital funds, and the importance of maintaining a proper maintenance cycle. Does us no good to save this money here right now, simply to spend even more repairing an existing fleet. So from a mechanical standpoint, Connor and Wendy, is there a way where we can maintain this allocation until a later date and revisit it? If for no, I mean, in a way it's kicking the can, but something is telling me that may be if nothing else, a prudent approach.
Well, if town meeting elects not to fund it, then the excess appropriation that we would be transferring funds to fund this would roll into free cash. That free cash would likely be used for capital needs in the fall for all of our departments and for additional reserve fund use in our operating budget.
In-
So
in essence, waiting till the fall to determine that is sort of what I'm thinking. Is that a realistic possibility, or is that creating other problems?
well, it's hard to be predictive with that. If town meeting decides not to fund this, and whatever aged vehicle that ought to have been replaced doesn't, and it makes it to fall and it gets funded perhaps at that time, then that's okay. If town meeting decides not to fund it and that vehicle falls apart and there's a need for an emergency repair, or for the department to come to the finance committee for an emergency reserve fund transfer, that could end up costing more money. It's you know, we commit to, in our bylaws that were established by the voters, lay out the capital planning process for this reason, to have a citizen committee go through these things and recommend them and to bring it to town meeting. But ultimately, town meeting's the appropriating body. If town meeting does not fund it, then those excess dollars would become free cash. But we couldn't say in a predictive way that it will cost us exactly X if you do that.
Right. So in essence, if we do, if at town meeting we do decline to fund this, in essence, the town is saying we're going to reject our well thought out capital planning process, and we're going to roll the dice till a later date, or just force the community to change unexpectedly how we equip our police force. So that is clarifying. That does help that question a good deal. Thank you.
Or we could just opt to not close the articles, the appropriations that currently exist that we were going to be transferring the money from. It is possible that we just don't close those out, and they would not become part of the free cash certification, and they could still be used like we're requesting they be used now towards capital in the fall.
Wendy, is that something that's not something that town decides? That's something that the administration decides, correct?
Yeah, we do that internally.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I saw Jamie and then Jeremy.
Yeah, I'll just say too, and this is really from, to Mike, is that it's cost avoidance, right? And as Connor mentioned, we can't predict these vehicles. If we have to replace a transmission on a vehicle with 150,000 miles on it, which is the equivalent of you or I having about 350,000 miles on that vehicle, because as Wendy mentioned, these cars sit and idle and they wait until that call comes in. And so, and these are being run 24/7, right? People look at the fleet and they say, why are there so many vehicles in the fleet? These cars we need to be prepared to take them out for just routine maintenance. Imagine your oil change every 5,000 miles now they recommend, and it's or X amount of months. These cars are hitting those in a week, weeks or month, 6 weeks. So it's very different wear and tear on these vehicles. And we know that if you've got to drop a transmission in it, or you need to do some other heavy maintenance item, that's money we don't want to spend on a vehicle with 150,000 miles on it. I don't want to spend $10,000 on that vehicle. I'd rather upfront keep this, these vehicles current and avoid its cost avoidance. So.
Sorry, I saw Jeremy and then Davis, I believe. Okay.
Thank you. And that's a really good point, Jamie. I appreciate that. So did anybody, I guess it would be a Patrick or Connor question, reach out to the chief to come to this meeting today? And did he respond if he was reached out to?
Can I answer that? Because
yeah, sorry.
I did not, and this was relatively quick turnaround for us to pull this meeting together and get this body together. So I apologize that I did not reach out and extend the invitation, because I know Chief Sullivan would have jumped at the opportunity to join us and speak. So he's done a great job of being involved in the community, and he's an outstanding member of not only the department, but just for our community. Excellent progressive person who's really about outreach. So my apologies that he's not here tonight.
All right. And then just my general comments, and I apologize, Mike, if I'm putting words in your mouth, please correct me, but I don't feel like this should be something we're voting on right now, especially if we don't have the chief here. So I don't know if we would like to table this until our next meeting when we could have him here. But I'll let you into my mindset. I don't think this is something we should be voting on now, at least in a recommended manner. So I apologize, Mike, if that's putting words in your mouth.
All right.
Not necessarily words in my mouth so much as I'm trying to determine whether it makes sense to, as I said, kick it down the road and maybe address it in the fall. As Wendy said, keep the articles open. But it's a tricky question because I'm very sympathetic to the importance of proper maintenance cycles. I mean, you come up with a maintenance cycle because it's the financially prudent thing to do. You don't come up with it because you want a new car. We have usually a very good understanding with these schedules of when it becomes more or less financially sound to replace something.
Mike, I just interrupt you for a quick second because I agree. And just to answer Jeremy's question about the chief being involved tonight, he wouldn't have any say. He's not the one that really comes up with the dollars and cents of the replacement schedule. And
he would be able to answer some of my questions that have gone unanswered. No, and no disrespect to any of you. I anticipated the chief being here, so I apologize for preparing my questions in that manner. But
is it regarding this particular article?
Yes, such as
your questions.
Yeah, so my question about how one less vehicle would impact the forward-facing police presence in the town, whether we would have slowed down response times, I think that's an appropriate question for the chief that I would.
Yeah, but would you
like to vote on this until we had it?
Would you not agree that if a vehicle goes out of service because it's damaged or because we lose a transmission and we would have replaced it, that is going to slow down our response time, or could, especially if it happened while a vehicle is in service on patrol?
It absolutely could, which is why I also asked the question about our staffing relative to next year. And I never got, not that I didn't get an answer, but no one was able to fully clarify whether that should, taking one FTE out equates to a reasonable assumption that we can afford to save this $54,000 and not have another patrol vehicle and have the remaining roll over into our general reserve.
Well, it cut out. I would just say I didn't understand part of it, only because you cut out for a brief second. But can you relate again the cutting of an FTE and the cruiser? What was
so I don't know. This is not my forte, so I appreciate you walking me through this. If we're cutting one FTE, it makes sense that we could afford fiscal sense, but maybe in the in a general sense of, that's going to be of less vehicles used because we're going to decrease our staff levels.
So I can answer that. The answer is no, because you're looking at multiple shifts, right? So one FTE means that we're probably going to pick up more overtime to cover that lost person on that shift, right? We still need the vehicle. It's just going to be used for someone who's now being called in. And so that's where you start to look at our minimum manning, which again, when we talk about being underfunded, that's one of the issues. We want to be at a certain manning level so that we're not spending more in overtime pay than we would be to just have an FTE, another full-time employee. So it's a great question, Jeremy. And you know that I appreciate where you're coming from because you ask great questions and really, and you help educate everybody, not just people that aren't as closely tied to, that don't understand the operating budget, but you help everybody. So that's a great question.
Thank you. Thank you for your response. That is something.
I saw a bunch of hands. I don't remember who was up. Davis is up right now, so we'll go with Davis.
Just to, I guess, I'm not sure if anyone here would know the answer. you know, is the number of vehicles, is that established as like a mandatory number? You know what I mean? Like, is there some regulation or part of the union contract or something that says, you know, we have to have on patrol, you know, 20 vehicles? Because I guess the real question would be, you know, if something were to break down, you know, would we be mandated to immediately replace that vehicle by some requirement somewhere, or is it a possibility that the police department would be, you know, functioning basically down one vehicle for as long as we didn't replace it?
So I can speak to that. It's not a function of a regulation or a union agreement. It's just a function of good management of our assets. That's all. There's no, to my knowledge, you know, the capital plan is not, there are some items in there that are relative to certain regulatory things we need to do, accessibility and things like that. But for fleet maintenance, it's basically best practice for all departments who have fleets of vehicles to try to maintain reasonably quality vehicles so that you're not spending more money on a worse product. You get the worst of both worlds if you consistently and purposefully avoid replacement schedules. It's the same with computers, technology, water pipes.
Okay, thank you. And just to kind of go off of that, I would like to hear, you know, Chief Partridge discuss what, or Chief Murphy, sorry, discuss what you know, what the justification is for that number of vehicles. I do understand from, I think from what Jamie has said and from a little bit of what Tim and Connor have said as well, I know that a lot of it is operating based on guidelines that are, you know, based on considerations like the population of the town, things like that. But my, you know, my concern is, I guess, you know, as much as this is about cost avoidance, it is certainly not the only cost avoidance item we have. You know, Wendy can attest to with the capital planning committee, there were a lot of cost avoidance things in there that simply lost out to simple, you know, personal safety coming first. So I guess to echo Jeremy's point, I certainly would like to hear from the police chief about, you know, what his opinion on the, you know, like if he could provide kind of real estimates on, as far as the service goes, what that effect would be. But I understand, you know, if people have their minds made up and think that that won't affect, you know, whether yes or no, I would be fine with having the vote right now. But I just might personally, I would like to, you know, get a solid description from him on that and give him a chance to justify it. Yeah, Connor.
Could I just clarify, you're on the capital planning committee, yes?
Yes, yep.
Did the chief come to the capital planning committee to discuss this during the normal capital planning process?
Yes, he did.
I think that's an important point because there are folks tuning in, which is good, and getting engaged, and that's great. But we're not, what we're talking about is basically one straggler of a capital budget that was first voted on in May of 2019. And there was a comment more than a question about budgets reflect priorities, and I agree with that. That's true. And to be clear, if you look at the fiscal 20 capital budget over the course of 2 town meetings, right? We had a portion of capital in the spring of 2019 for fiscal 20, and that was roughly $2.1 million in capital spend for water, DPW, schools, fire. 0 was for the police. And then in the fall, there was another multi-$100,000 supplemental capital budget, at which point this initial appropriation of $130,000 for these cruisers was there. So the total capital, which was presented to citizen committees by the chief, where these questions are asked, went through that process. You're looking at a capital budget for fiscal 20 of roughly 2.4 million, of which 150,000 is for these cruisers. I just want to be clear on that because I agree. Budgets are reflections of priority. And if you look just at this one article, it looks like the fiscal 20 budget for capital was just this, and that is not the case.
Sure, and thank you for providing that context. That is good. It's I wouldn't be sure if everyone would know about the capital planning committee, but if I can just add as well, you know, I did vote yes on this back when it came before the capital planning committee in the fall, and that was before a lot of things happened between February and now. And as much as it does seem to be maybe a drop in the bucket, you know, it's for the past several years, you know, we've really been fighting these things on the margins, and I do think, you know, that at least personally, I would benefit from some more information from the chief. But again, you know, if other people think that they're settled and that, you know, they have enough information, then, you know, I'd be fine with voting tonight.
You know, the one thing I just want to go back to is how significantly underfunded we are. And I already mentioned the stats, so I'm not going to repeat them. But that alone will tell you that if you compared our equipment to the core communities, the neighboring communities, you would find that we work very efficiently with much less than they have. And we cover a fairly significant geography when you look at the size of Easton from, you know, miles covered, right? So, and that's expanding. We have communities that are expanding out towards Mansfield, towards Norton. So this is only going to get greater. And we know that. We see this on the fire side too, because we're concerned about response time. And we're concerned from an apparatus standpoint, how safely can we get our firefighters to that fire? You know, and if you look at our response times now, they're excellent. We stop and we prevent a lot of structural fires from getting to the point where we lose structures. Same can be said for that police response. Is we want them to get there not only safely, but in time to, you know, de-escalate the situation, or to be there when someone overdoses, because oftentimes police department are the first responders and they're there with an Arcan and they're there saving lives. And then they're working in conjunction with the fire department, or, you know, obviously all of our paramedics on staff with the fire department that arrive to assist. So it's very important that we have that response time, and we don't allow something like this, which is, again, I think a great cost avoidance measure and also a public safety measure, to kind of get in the way. So I'm going to say this is important that we vote on this and kind of move forward.
I would also ask that you do vote on it, because there's really only nine marked cruisers, you know, for the whole town. They're in use constantly, and just deferring this to the fall doesn't mean if it's voted on in the fall and they're going to turn around the next day and go buy a cruiser. Chances are by that time, there's not going to be a cruiser available until probably the spring of 2021. So it's going to kick the can down the road, you know, a little bit further than probably we're all thinking.
Roberta, did you have something? I know your hand was up before. You're on mute.
Better. I was just going to ask the question, is there an obligation with this free cash and where it's coming from now that we have to spend this money in a certain amount of time? And that question go to Wendy and Connor about that the free cash, certainly the certification expires, but is there an expense that we have to make, basically?
No, there's no obligation that you spend it in a certain time or way. Whatever you don't spend of any type of appropriation, absent it being rolled forward for another use, would just turn into free cash in the coming year.
Thank you.
There's several questions that are sort of in the same area. I'm gonna pick some that I think cover a lot of the same points from the Q&A. Is there anything else that anyone on the committee would like to ask or discuss before we get to that? Jeremy.
This is a procedural question. Are we able to make a motion with amendment if it's already in the article, the warrant article?
I do not know the answer to that.
I guess it depends in what context, Jeremy. What's the
changing the dollar amount?
Okay, so is the question, can finance committee
only vote to recommend with that amendment?
For the capital budget we're talking about?
Yes, for the current Article 5.
I believe you could. You would need to be specific.
Yeah, obvious. I'm just asking generally procedurally. Thank you.
Very often. We've had some that have sort of been answered in the discussion that we've had. I'll just speak to a few of those. Andrew Abramson from Fort Flint Lane has asked about free cash being used in times of economic downturns. Given that we're now likely in a recession, should we trust Eastern voters to transfer this money to departments that might be in more need of money? Just off the top, obviously that's something that could be addressed. Connor, fill me in here, in town meeting. That's something that the town meeting actually takes the appreciation of, I would assume.
Yeah, so it's a good question from Andrew about using free cash in an operating budget in a time of crisis, and we are already doing that. That is already the plan for fiscal 21, right? And that's going to be a really tough budget year for everyone, unfortunately, because of the coronavirus-induced recession. So we will be using half of the available free cash on hand to plug into the operating needs. It's about $1 million next year. It's significant, and it's not good long-standing financial practice. That's in addition to about $500,000 in stabilization. So we're already allocating roughly a third of our total reserve capacity in next year's budget. So again, we're kind of straying here across a few articles, but I think that's okay because this is a really good way to look at it. So the short answer is yes, voters absolutely have the right to understand that and participate that, and they do. And we talk about this a lot every year because we rely on free cash in the operating budget to support our departments, not just on the town side, but on the schools as a funding source, because we don't have a recurring revenue source that meets our expense needs to provide the programs and employ the people we need to do. So that's something we do every year, including the coming year. And even with that practice and with additional reserve spending, you're still looking at these really difficult and painful budgets for the schools and for towns that are basically zeros for the current year. So it's a good question. And the short answer is yes, it is something we are doing.
Thanks, Connor. Next up is Hannah 2, 148 Randall Street. How much has the police department budget been reduced relative to the other departments percentage-wise? I don't think we can answer this because it's not finalized, right? We don't have a final number as of yet, so this is something that it's still sort of an academic question.
No, I mean, we can. I think that at some point, you know, we are going to talk about the operating budget with another article. So, you know, you can continue to take questions about operating things under this. I don't know if it's necessarily the right place because I assume there's also going to be a lot of questions about the operating budget, which again, to be clear, is not yet fully balanced. But yeah, we can talk about that either now or in 10 minutes when we're on that article. It's your choice.
I mean, I assume that this is probably going to be because based on the conversations that I've seen and the discussions I've seen, it seems like a lot of these questions are relative to 5, 6, and 7. So it's probably going to be a rolling discussion, I would assume, on all three. I think we can table that one. We'll come back to it at the operational because I think that one is something that is going to be much more in tune. But with that, there's also some that are very much in the line of, let's see. For instance, this one, Christian Morrow, 38 Greenfield Street. Pardon the maybe simple question, but how can we as residents request a reduced fleet size for the EPD in general? Which is a question that I see as someone asking for some information on what they can do relative to this process. I think it's probably something that's valuable to dive into.
Sure. So, I mean, you're doing the first step now by getting engaged and following these meetings. And it can sometimes be kind of confusing in this like maze of bureaucratic institutions, but the fleet size of the police or any other department is managed through the capital budgeting process. And so that is a public process. We have a capital planning committee of citizens of Easton, who including representatives from finance committee like Davis, and they meet throughout the year to review capital requests that I and Wendy consolidate. We direct departments to submit their 5-year capital plans. So you can go on our website and go to our budget pages. Our budget book has the 5-year capital improvement plan for all of our departments. And the time to talk about that, you could always email us and make those suggestions or ask to, for more information, or you can go to capital planning committee meetings when they're receiving and reviewing these capital planning items. So when the capital planning committee gets it, each department comes in with a presentation, with the financials, with the operational information to lay out, this is why we're asking for this now versus in next year. This is why it's a relative priority for us now. And then the capital planning committee votes to create a relative prioritization of each item. And they use basically as a rubric the capital planning bylaw that's been adopted by voters. So that was, I apologize, a really jargon heavy way to say you participate in the capital planning meetings. All of our boards and committees have to publish agendas under state law. So if you go to our website and click on minutes and agendas, you can actually sign up. There's an email notice function so that for whatever board or committee you're interested in, whether it's finance committee, school committee, select board, capital planning, you can sign up so that every time an agenda gets posted, it just gets sent directly to you rather than putting the onus on you to, periodically check a town website. You'll get it sent directly to you. So that's a really good way to stay in the know about when those boards and committees are meeting. Again, those are public. You could participate in them in that way.
Connor, there's two questions sort of in the same realm from the same person, which is Hannah 2, 148 Randall Street. It's about cost avoidance. So this feels like it's more of a judgment answer, but I figure we should ask it just because I think the cost avoidance piece is interesting. Is why is cost avoidance more important for police department than for funding new water pipes or technology? Why is it necessary for the police to do everything? Can these responsibilities not be deferred to others such as EMS who are more equipped to deal with medical emergencies? I think from a cost avoidance standpoint, it's something that we can obviously, we've spoken about to a great deal tonight so far. The cost avoidance association with repair versus replace, it makes sense in those contexts, but maybe from a wider standpoint, there's obviously a lot of cost avoidance going on across multiple departments. Wendy or Connor, is there anything that you could speak to about what that looks like from a more macro level, and not just obviously the focus on this is here because of the article, because of the current situation, but from a macro side, what's that look like across the town?
So, I think that it's a good question, and it ties back to sort of the conversation we've been having about the relative prioritization of various needs. And it's not an either or, it's a deliberative process by the capital planning committee. And if you do look at what the capital budgets that are advanced to town meeting and are funded typically, they do prioritize, defibrillators for the fire department, who are our medical technicians, obviously, ambulances for folks. So it's meant to basically be a competitive evaluative process. So this item, again, seems like it's kind of out on an island in that it's its own priority. And that's understandable that it seems that way because it's the only item for fiscal 20 capital, but that's because the fiscal year ends in 3 weeks and the other items that were scheduled to be funded already were. And in many cases in significantly larger amounts for other departments like water pipes. For instance, we just funded, I think, about a $2 to $3 million waterworks project on Foundry Street this summer, much to the chagrin of everyone who had to drive through there. We apologize for that part, but it's not an either or. And so this is alone here as this one article, not because it was the only priority of capital funding. I think it's fair to look at it and say it was the last priority of the fiscal 20 capital budget that made the cut.
And then to the second point that she'd asked, which is effectively why is this falling to the police or for the police to run these types of things? Sure. Why is this not something deferred to EMS and to potentially fire? I correct me if I'm wrong, and Tim, obviously you have some direct knowledge of this yourself. It's not that it's necessary. It's that the police are being called on these types of calls anyway, right? These are procedural matters that police are going out to these types of calls no matter what, both from a public safety standpoint and because it's oftentimes 911 directly connects to all these different departments. Am I in the ballpark on that? That was my assumption based on that question.
Yeah, so I'm not going to comment on strategies that department heads make in order to protect the town. I think they've made it very clear in previous meetings that they are doing the best they can with the manpower they have and the budgets they're given. It's no secret that all these departments across the board on the front line have been underfunded for a while, and we're trying their best to keep them up, doing the best they can with what they got. The reason that police officers respond to these calls is multi-tiered. It's not just to assist with EMS. The reason that they usually get there before us is because we have fire stations, and it wouldn't be prudent for a fire truck to be patrolling the town constantly, where police cruisers, they have the ability to conduct police work and respond to EMS calls while they're already on the road. So quite frequently they get there before us in a much shorter time. The reason that they administer, everybody in town as a police officer carries DFibs, they carry first aid kits, and they're all qualified first responders. The reason for that as well is that every minute that passes after somebody goes into cardiac arrest, this is just a simple AHA statistic, every minute that passes while somebody goes into a cardiac arrest reduces their chance of survival by 10%. So to equate that into what a response time would look like, which was one of the questions Jeremy was talking about, would this increase response times? When we talk a matter of 60 seconds, it's 10% of somebody's ability to well, their chance of survival during one of these episodes. So obviously, that being said, if you look at a 911 response, it's an average of 3 minutes to 6 minutes to get through a 911 call from a state 911, because it goes to the state, then it goes to the local dispatch, goes through a system of checks, and then gets dispatched out. You already lost a 60% chance of survival. So getting a police cruiser there within the first minute of hitting that radio call drastically increases a person's chance of survival. And this is something that happens on the regular. You know, the police department and fire department work almost seamlessly in conjunction with each other to provide the safety at that respect. Also, after the police administer that care, they're also tasked with the safety of the scene in regards to keeping the fire department safe traffic-wise. And there's also a lot of other medical scenes that often involve police presence for the safety of the providers or the people on scene receiving the care, because there's all kinds of different kind of issues that go on with 911, be it domestic or otherwise. So, you know, it's a, you know, to say, should they just be policing? I think in a perfect world where you could have each department just do their job with, you know, a full manpower staffing, even then I think it would be difficult to reduce those times. But with these two departments working in conjunction with each other, they're doing the best they can to keep them those times as low as possible. So, you know, I think the police are tasked with that difficult job, and the cruiser's the toolbox to do it.
Connor, go ahead.
Could I just, Tim, I don't want to blow up your spot here, but for folks who are watching, you're speaking from personal experience, right? You are a firefighter here.
That's correct. I mean, I have the privilege of being on the road and serving the community in that aspect, you know, and it's to say it's not the easiest of tasks all the time is something I could say publicly and be fine with. And what I mean is that it's a lot of responsibility, and it's really doing the best you can with what you got. And when you have, you know, 2 to 3 cruisers on the road to cover almost 40 square miles, it's a lot of ground to cover. So this is one of the tools to get there. You know, when we talked about cost avoidance and that kind of stuff, I can tell you these vehicles do take a beating. You know, I wish we could appropriate the Chapter 90 funds tonight to get those roads repaired the best we can. But that's part of the, you know, part of the reason. But yeah, it's a lot to go through. I know, I think the fire department side, I can see the abuse these vehicles take and what we need to do to keep them on the road and keep them running. The finance committee side, I can also take a look at this and say, you know, how are we going to avoid spending more money down the road? And that doesn't just go for police cruisers, it goes for every line item that we review. And I think that if we can take a look back at the past couple of years and say that we're going over our repair and maintenance costs on a yearly basis, and with the vehicle replacement plan that we have in place, it shows you how difficult maintaining these vehicles.
Thank you, Tim. Is there anyone else that wants to comment on that particular aspect? So I have one question that's been asked twice, and I think it does a good job of. It's not 100% on topic, but I think it does a good job of sort of addressing the elephant that might be in the room for a lot of these discussions, which is it's from Andrew Abramson. And he says, would not recommending this budget send a clear message from the Finance Committee that you all reject systemic racism in the police system, including right here in Houston, where multiple racist incidents have occurred? Now, I want to address this specifically from two paths, which is effectively, I want to make it clear that recommending or not recommending this line item, I don't think sends a message, in my own personal idea, of whether or not the people on this committee reject systemic racism. I want to make that clear. I would be shocked if everyone on this committee did not reject systemic racism. If I have to call it out to make it clear, I absolutely do. My own experience in this, and my own experience in Easton, obviously as a white male, is nowhere near the same experience that a lot of other people have had. But at the same time, I'm looking at this as a separate issue, and I don't want to, in my own personal opinion, I don't want to vote yes or no on a capital issue symbolically, right? And I understand the ask, and I understand the desire, and I understand the motive behind it, right? As a town, if we're coming together on this past Sunday and speaking about how as a town we can do better and how we can make changes for ourselves and for our citizens and for our children, then obviously I think almost everyone would be on board with that. But I also want to make sure that I want to vote on this based on the parameters of the article, and not use it as sort of like potentially a way out of a further conversation. And I mentioned this briefly at the beginning, and I'm absolutely asking for comments on this, but effectively this is something it's not 100% in our purview, right, as an advisory body to make those types of decisions that are very either policy driven or somehow symbolic in these aspects. And Andrew, I don't think it's a bad question. I think it's actually a great question to ask, and to ask about sort of how we as a town are going to speak to the current state of the world. But at the same time, I don't know that deflecting money for a replacement vehicle is as engaging as other items. I don't know that it is. I don't know that it isn't. Right. I'm looking at this from that side of it. I appreciate you asking the question and sort of bringing it up to the forefront. Like, yes, there are obviously overtones here that we want to talk about. But again, this comes back to the fact that we don't even have a final budget to vote on tonight, which is why number 7 we're going to talk about and answer questions, but we don't actually have a vote for it. So if the idea is that we need to send a clear message by voting not recommend on this, and that's somehow going to be our way of saying we reject systemic racism, I don't know that those two things are necessarily combined. I think that we can do both. We can vote based on the merits of this article, yes or no. And again, I don't know how this is going to go with everyone on the committee, but I think we can also do both. And I think that it's important to say that they're not necessarily tied together. And I open it up to anyone else who has any other questions or comments on that. Let's go with Mike.
So Patrick, I want to echo your sentiments, and we certainly don't need to go one by one and echo them. But it is crucial to note that I think all of us emphatically reject systemic racism. And I think that the things that we've seen in our community, we've participated in our community, and we've seen around the United States and the world, have raised important, legitimate questions about our entire approach to public safety. Questions and perspectives that I'm intrigued by, I'm fascinated by, in many ways I'm persuaded by. But I think it's important that we ask the question how we would vote on adhering to a pre-planned maintenance schedule. I think we need to ask, does our vote on that signal something larger? I really don't think that it does. And I've actually been sitting here through this whole discussion asking myself that question. Does it? And there's a part of me that's inclined to say, with all that's going on, maybe I should say no. I'm coming to the very simple conclusion. This is a financial question. This is, do we adhere to a maintenance schedule? And the other argument that somebody might make to say, no, it's a bad idea, and Jeremy, you hinted at this, I think, again, not to put words in your mouth, is, do we need the cruiser? Could we just have a smaller fleet? And I think that's a legitimate question. I don't think how we vote on this particular warrant article, though, even gets at that. If were we to say, no, let's not follow the fleet management plan, that somehow we're casting a vote as to how we do fleet management, like, broadly. I think all we would be doing is saying, let's chuck the fleet management plan, which is a predictive maintenance and financial maintenance sort of question. It's just my very long-winded way of saying, let's not overload this question with too much, because I get the sense that I'm emphatically in agreement with some of the sentiments that the community is raising in the chat, Andrew's comments in particular. But I'm not sure that they pertain to this particular warrant article. So I'll go back to being quiet.
Jen?
Question for Connor. I think there's a lot of, I'm struggling with a lot of the same things that have been raised here as well. And I think we're heading into territory where bigger forces are going to muddy the waters of what we're trying to contemplate here. So Connor, is there going to be an avenue for folks in town, for residents, to start to untangle some of these issues that are coming into the warrant articles? Will there be an opportunity for folks to discuss that at some point, so we can have a more clear, well thought out response instead of reacting in a way that we may be cutting off our nose to spite our face and not realizing it? I know there's a lot of emotion, and I feel that too. And I'm trying to listen to these questions and getting emotional myself thinking about it, because it's really heavy. But I feel like maybe having some sort of forum or outlet for people to start exploring this as a community and what it means, and a commitment from the town would be really huge, and make me feel more comfortable proceeding on this question.
So, I've been thinking a lot about that. And I agree with you. It's emotional and it's difficult. And it's something, so, and just by way of background, my professional training, when people are studying to be town managers or town administrators, and they, like anything else, like with a CPA for financial folks, you have professional accreditations and institutions you go to and you participate in, and it's basically beaten into you that your job is to be this unthinking, unfeeling, unblinking, somewhat robotic, bureaucrat who focuses on moving dollars around on budgets and, helping people conduct charrettes for planning purposes, and that you don't weigh into anything that could possibly be construed as political, which obviously for any of us who work in public life know is basically impossible, right? Because everything is political. Budgets are political, right? Anytime you have finite resources being divided up, you're making value judgments, and those are important. And so, I've been trying to think about how, because we're aware, we saw the school committee, we saw a tremendous amount of engagement there. And we know, the incredible amount of engagement that we've seen in Easton, protests in the past few weeks. And so I tried to think of how to kind of address that question, Jen. And so I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to talk about that process. And I hope this is not overly indulgent, and I'm trying to come from an honest and heartfelt place. So I hope the folks who are joining this meeting hear that. And so, getting engaged and getting involved in local government is really important. And as we're kind of talking about this, and the conversation is flowing through various warrant articles from both a financial priorities perspective, but also talking about really important matters like justice. And so that's obviously not something that is immediately or obviously germane to the Finance Committee's charge as a body, or something that is clearly stated as an item that this group would be discussing on the agenda. But in thinking about this and trying to put words together on how to talk about it, rather than us, and you haven't, Patrick, or anyone on the committee, I give you credit, but rather than use the fact that this isn't an agenda item for the finance committee to basically avoid this important conversation, you know, I want to try to give a bit of context to people who are tuning in about what processes there are for changing policies and budgets and priorities in local government, and not to just say this is the wrong place, go away, you know, because that's terrible, and none of us want to do that. We want to listen, but to actually lay out what those tools are for people who are hurting, to get involved and to keep the conversation going. And so, you know, Mike, not to have everyone go through one by one and say this, but I have not, you know, as the town administrator, really spoken about this at all. And I would like to, before talking about process, speak to the unrest and the emotions we're feeling and the struggles that people are feeling in a time of what I think is a national tragedy, where I think our nation is in crisis, and it's hurting. And, you know, the police chief, myself, the select board, and I trust everyone on the finance committee and everyone in this meeting are horrified by the killing of George Floyd. We condemn the Minneapolis Police Department and all acts of brutality committed against folks by police. And more broadly, you know, acknowledge and condemn the cancer of systemic and institutionalized racism, which is real and exists and has plagued this country since before the Constitution was signed, and continues to perpetuate injustice against people and communities of colors. And that's been the case for hundreds of years. So, you know, there's rightfully growing attention on the national stage talking about criminal justice reform in the wake of these most recent tragedies. And concurrently, we know there's growing energy in communities around the country, including right here, and we're seeing it right now, to broaden the conversation and reassess our own policies, our own standards, what we value for public safety, for education, for social programs. And you're seeing that now with the people who are coming to this meeting, the people who came last night to the school committee and getting involved. And what's the intersectionality there with budgets and the finance committee? You know, the town of Easton has had a fundamental revenue problem for many, many, many years, since at least 2008. And it limits our ability to adequately fund all of our departments: schools, police, fire, public works. And it necessitates that those departments therefore have to work together. You know, when you look at a budget, you do carve out and kind of compartmentalize spending, right? Because you need to make some rhyme and reason and some sense of where those dollars go. But in reality, all of our departments do work together. And, you know, the police department here is one of those. And in my experience, obviously my lived experience with Police Chief Sullivan is compassionate and a progressive chief who strives for his department to work with all town and school departments and better serve the community that they care about. Many of the members of the department live here. They raise their families here. You know, this example was touched on, talking about response times and why would an officer have Narcan rather than have more EMTs. And I think, you know, Tim spoke to that really fantastically from an operational perspective, as far as cruisers being on the move and fire apparatus being at the station. But it's important to understand from a kind of policy perspective that in the past 5 years, the police chief has worked with our Department of Health and Community Services to make sure that we do have personnel trained on the administration of Narcan to prevent those fatal overdoses and to connect those folks with recovery resources. So rather than criminalizing addiction, officers who are often first on the scene just by virtue of the fact that they're in more mobile apparatus, when someone has a loved one overdosing, they call 911 and say, please help. They don't call and say, you know, please send this apparatus or that. It's whoever is closest and, to Tim's point, can save a life. And they're trained to do so and connect those folks with recovery and mental health resources with Wings of Hope and other community groups to help people. None of that is to say that the police department or any of our departments, my department, my office, is immune to criticism, or that we should be immune to conversations or efforts around change. And also, you know, I understand that my experience is not everyone's experience, and I don't assume that that's the case. We need to listen and to hear from everyone's experiences, particularly people who look like me in jobs like mine. I'm in a pretty privileged position. I need to listen to people during a difficult time. The town needs to listen. But part of listening is also being real about what processes are. And if we're going to have these conversations, we need to be mindful that policy reform, reprioritizing in a big way, what government programs we should have as a community, that's not only a function of amending or adjusting budgets 12 days before town meeting. It has to be and is necessarily a participatory and a thoughtful process. And it requires input not only just from the folks who are doing the work and showing up right now, but from the departments in question, from civic groups, from community groups of all backgrounds, and from legal experts. The Finance Committee, Jen, to try and keep myself from meandering too far from your question, has an important role in town government. You're elected. And your role is by charter, which was written by and adopted by the voters of this community, not by me or some other bureaucrat, charges you with making recommendations on warrant articles to voters at town meeting. And if the desire, as we're seeing with some of these questions, is only to ask that the Finance Committee recommend against one article, that's a completely reasonable request that folks have every right to ask you. And for you to take a position, yay or nay, on any of those is entirely within your statutory charge and responsibility, just as it's within every single voter's right to attend town meeting and make their position known. And I also want to take a chance to clarify, because I've seen some of the questions about this. Voters can debate articles even if they're recommended by Finance Committee and Select Board. It is not a prerequisite in order for you to be heard as a voter of this community that the Finance Committee says not recommend an article. Anyone who's a registered voter at town meeting, you can have an article with screaming recommendations from every board that weighed in. Everyone has the right to be heard and participate and encourage that debate. And that's one of the wonderful things about town meeting. So none of that is to marginalize the request for a negative recommendation. That's completely within folks who are tuning in's rights to ask for that. And that's within the Finance Committee's purview to make that decision. I just want to make clear that even if they do not, you and every other voter in town has every right to go to town meeting and make your position known and debate the merits of every article. However, picking up from what Jen is saying, that this is kind of a bigger conversation. If the desire extends beyond just having a negative vote on a couple of articles, and if the desire is to start a bigger conversation about structural and lasting policy change, there's a process and a forum for that. Voters of this town elect the Select Board to drive policy. And if you have ideas in that realm about broader town policy, about broader priorities for the community and what we're doing, what we can do better, because we always need to strive to do better and we always can do better, let them know. Contact them, email them. You can email the board at selectboard@easton.ma.us. Their contact information is readily available on the website, as is mine. If the desire here is above and beyond these limited articles and it's to drive change on the revenue side, right? A lot of these questions are focusing around a completely legitimate question of, we are in crisis, right? And we are. The community is, the budget is, the nation is. This is a very hard time, and that's real. And so if the desire is to drive change from that perspective in a sustaining and meaningful way, so that there's revenue, so that the schools, so that the health departments, and so that all of our departments are not continuously underfunded, which they are across the board, and which was true before the current economic catastrophe brought on by COVID came here and put us where we are right now. There's a process and a forum for that. Easton lost millions of dollars in annual revenue, millions per year from the Commonwealth. We rely on revenue from the state of Massachusetts for education financing. We lost millions of dollars of education funding from the state in the last recession back in 2008. And it took us 8 years. It took until 2016, not adjusting for inflation, just to get back to where we were. So we never recovered from those cuts. They've created a structural revenue shortfall that damages our ability to deliver high quality services that we know we ought to be doing across all of our departments. And attempting to fix that on the local level is more involved and takes more time, than moving some money from one department that's underfunded to another that's underfunded. That may have a minor impact, and that may be what people wish to do at town meeting, and that's within town meeting's authority. And I'm not standing in the way of that. But if the goal is to talk about policy change and engagement that drives a sustainable improvement to our abilities to do right by you, attempting to fix that often involves pursuing an override to increase taxes and generate new revenue. And voters of this town are in charge of whether that goes yay or nay. And they've resoundingly rejected a request for exactly that only a few years ago. If you want that to change, if the people coming to this meeting or anyone on finance committee want that to change, that is there's a forum and a process for that. Please write the select board and join that conversation and ask them to join you in it. Finally, it's important, as much as it seems like kind of boring bureaucratic dressings, to be aware of what our own constraints are as government officials and as local government boards. Our boards and committees have to, under state law, post agendas in advance that clearly state topics of discussion in advance of the meetings so that everyone, regardless of their view on it, who has an interest in that topic can hear, see, and participate in really important conversations like the one that we're having right now. This is important not just for us to obey the law, but if we really want to do the work and have these really difficult, emotional, but important conversations, we owe it to everyone, including folks here today and to everyone else who's interested in the community, to have that forum, to have that notice, and to have the time to think about the topic in advance so they can participate. So email the select board, let them know what you think and what are you concerned with in the community. Where are we falling short and what do you want to see change? And we'll be in touch with you and let you know when we can move this to an open meeting on an agenda where everyone interested can participate in that conversation together. I don't say any of this and go through this kind of long explanation of process to discourage the engagement of the people who came here today. The opposite is true. I commend you for it. I'm proud to see younger people participating in such an important and in an impassioned and real way. And I'm explaining this process and walking through this to be honest and forthright and real with you that there are processes and forums for bigger change, that it requires the consistent and persistent investment of time and energy, and trying to let you know how do you access that forum. And that's by contacting us, contacting the select board, so that we can keep the conversation about policy going and have it in an open way with the people that need to be there with the authority to have it and work together to make the town better. And I apologize for the lengthiness of that. I really wanted to try to speak to, the legitimacy of the feelings that people are having. We're in a really difficult place, and we need to have difficult conversations. And I hope that that's helpful. And it's not meant to be, a long way of saying you're not on the agenda, see ya. My email's public. It's cread, CREAD @easton.ma.us, selectboard@easton.ma.us. You can get in touch with us and we can keep this conversation moving in a way that's the deliberate goal rather than necessarily trying to make a capital item proxy for it. So I hope that was helpful, Jen, and everyone who's here.
Thank you, Connor.
Thank you, Connor. Thank you.
Well said. Thank you.
Very well said, Connor. The next couple questions, effectively there's one, it's Andrew Abramson. He actually has two that I think are sort of related. The first one is there a chance, is it possible for him to speak? Which, as we said at the top of the meeting, we're not actually we can't take speakers. We're asking for submissions via text. It's the process of what's been outlined in the agenda from the agenda's submission. So we're not taking any speakers. We are asking you to please submit your questions directly. His second question, and I will get to both of you in a moment. His second question is that how can we reject systemic racism without acknowledging the police system is a major contributor to the issue? Cities across the nation began cutting funds in the police department. Why shouldn't Easton do the same? And I want to reiterate the point that we made, that, and Connor, I think you said this earlier, that they are right. There is a cut across the board. Do you want to explain any of the process now, or should we wait until we get to what we will be discussing on number 7, which talks about a lot of the cuts that are across all departments.
You know, it's all of our departments in response to the economic crisis we're in are having their requests reduced. You know, as far as what other cities are doing, you know, it's not necessarily immediately transferable. You need to evaluate these things on a community to community basis, and you know, to my point, if there's a broader concern of systemic racism and inequity in the administration of service, that is a longer conversation that we need to have. That as much as it would probably be easier for me in this moment to say, sure, add more to the cut we're doing, I think it would be disingenuous of me to do that and basically say problem solved. So I know I'll be held accountable for that, and I trust that those who are watching this will, and will, you know, take me to task to keep this conversation going.
You, Connor. We had several people ask for comments. Jeremy, and then Roberta.
Why are we not taking in-person questions? I don't know what you want to call it. Verbal, non-written questions.
For 2 reasons. First, the agenda calls out that any submissions of questions will be via the Q&A, the actual webinar setup. So the agenda itself lays out that for this meeting, for a general meeting, this is something where we take them in written form. Also, because we are facing ourselves in the position of, frankly, if there's a question that is not on topic, which we've had multiple that don't directly relate to the system, that don't or don't relate to the article, do not format themselves in the way that has been asked with name and address, then it's something that we do not include. Obviously, it's a way to make sure that we're not violating that open meeting law aspect of this. We're doing what we can to obviously facilitate a discussion that people want to have. To Connor's earlier point, we didn't want to shut this down, right? We don't want to say, sorry, we don't have to take public comments. It's not in the agenda, so we could actually just be like, let's vote, right? Internal conversation, vote, and move on. But that's not ideal, right? We want to hear from people, and we want to obviously answer the questions that are going to make their voting decisions that much more informed.
Then sorry. I guess it moves to my comment then that I hope in the future that we can change that, because other committees do, and I think that is very helpful. And I think it's something that we can absolutely figure out.
Oh yeah, it's totally possible if it's included in the agenda.
Thank you.
Roberta, I think you were up next.
Yeah, I think I've been quiet, right? I've been listening to everyone speaking. Points very, very valid. I've been watching the questions that have come up through the chat and the discussions. Connor, I've heard you, we're talking about the forum. Hannah, the most recent and last question that's in this says a very poignant and important piece. You can't separate finance from values. Well, how accurate of a statement is that? It's wildly true. At the same time, I can't help but remember, 2 years ago, we had the Parkland shooting, and the community was clamoring for additional police services. That was just 2 years ago. We're not so far away from that, and the pendulum is swinging, absolutely. I am, in my heart, systemic racism is a problem, and we have policy that has to change at a national level and at all kinds of community levels. And I absolutely am just disgusted by what happened in Minneapolis. There's such a bigger issue here. This particular article that's presented before us has to do with capital funding that was allocated, vetted, presented to the Capital Planning Committee. Thank you, Davis, for sitting on that group and bringing that story to us as it happened. This particular item now is about whether or not we want to, as a committee, recommend additional funds to augment the purchase of 3 vehicles, because the money that was used was only enough to purchase 2 at the time. That's the fundamental crux of this article tonight. It's not about systemic racism. It's not about augmenting the police department or not. This is fundamentally about resources in our town. I'd like to make a motion that we proceed to vote.
Second.
Do I have a second?
Second. Stebbins.
With that, I will go through a roll call. I'm not on mute, right? Yeah, okay. DePietro.
Yes, DePietro.
Healy.
I did have something to add, but I think I can probably add it in the budget item upcoming because I assume the discussion will be the same. Healy, yes.
Burville.
Burville, no.
Stebbins.
Stebbins, yes.
Stacy.
Stacy, no.
Temelio.
No.
Bamosi.
Famosa, yes.
And Helen, I'm a yes.
Sorry, Patrick. So that was I had my head so buried in what I was planning on saying. So that was the motion. That was the actual vote, not to like cut off discussion and do it, but that was to vote on the article.
I was under the impression that was the motion to cut off discussion.
I was under the impression that it was for the article. So can we repeat and clarify?
Yeah, agreed. We'd have to repeat, clarify. I thought it was for the article.
The motion was, as I heard Roberta say it, motion to move to vote.
Right.
Do we need one of those?
We don't, but if we want to eliminate additional conversation, I assume that that's a legitimate motion to make.
And can we revote? Because that was not my understanding.
Yeah, that's fine. If there was a confusion on it, then obviously we can take that back in. So
I'm with Jeremy. There was confusion. Sorry about that.
100%. So to that point, then, Davis, you had a point you wanted to make. If we're back to a point where we're not limiting additional discussion, there's no additional questions that haven't been answered already about number 5. Davis, what was the point that you wanted to make? And then we will move to a motion to approve or to recommend or not recommend.
Sure, thank you. So I think, I mean, to the question that I think it was Andrew asked about, and that Connor spoke to a little bit about how, you know, what is this intersection between our function as the finance committee and, you know, how systemic racism exists, how it's perpetuated, you know, what our role is in addressing it. I think that obviously people are echoing the point, you know, the concept of police abolition, you know, this idea that the police as an institution in the US have roots that, you know, that were founded in, you know, this repression of minority communities and enslaved patrols and stuff like that. And so the argument is that it's an unsalvageable institution, and that, you know, we have a direct equal sign where, you know, less police directly equals more racial equality, or more racial justice. And people in the crowd can, you know, obviously, if that's completely off base, you can feel free to say so. But you know, I don't think it's on us as a board of 9 white folks to absolve ourselves of of our responsibility to consider what effects on systemic racism our actions have. I do get people's view that, you know, we can separate out the vote on, you know, this one item from that. I respectfully disagree. I think that, you know, no matter what, we can't avoid the consequences of our actions just because they aren't the priority we have in mind. If I'm being quite honest to Andrew, or whoever asked the question, if it wasn't Andrew, I don't know, you know, enough about how our police department interacts with our minority communities. You know, Tim and Jamie have pointed out that one of the functions they serve is, you know, life-saving procedures in response to drug overdoses. You know, I definitely understand that, you know, especially in somewhere like Minneapolis, where their police department has been, you know, the focus of complaints like this for decades now. That's a very easy line to draw. And it could be in Easton too, truthfully, it really could be. But I don't know enough about that relationship to really definitively say, you know, like here is our place to take a stand by denying this funding for this last police cruiser. You know, certainly if I was looking at my elected representatives and that was the action they took, and then they tried to sell it to me as, look, we're fighting systemic racism, I would be like, yeah, okay, dude, whatever. So I do think it's, you know, I do think we have the responsibility to consider that when making decisions, and that's largely been one of the main thrusts of the movements that have arisen in the aftermath of the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. But I just, you know, it's I'd love to talk to the chief about it. I'd love to get more information. But like, you know, like a couple other people have said, it's such a broad issue that involves so many different factors of town finance and, you know, town administration, that to, you know, say that we have to plant the flag here and now, and that's, you know, that's basically like the fight. Maybe you're right. Maybe that is true. But I certainly wouldn't, you know, assume the worst of anyone on this committee who sees it differently. And so with that in mind, to repeat what, you know, echo what Connor said, I do think that it obviously does need to be addressed more broadly, and a great way to do that is through the select board and through kind of more participation in the larger process. But yeah, I don't disagree that it's on us to consider whether or not our finance decisions are directly, you know, impacting Easton's marginalized and minority communities. And you are certainly right that finance, how we decide to spend money, you know, will definitely create winners and losers along those lines. Yeah, I don't really have a way to tie it up. I wanted to add that to the discussion.
Thank you, Davis.
Yeah, I'll just say thank you as well. And, you know, this board is trying to do what this board was tasked to do. And I agree that the larger discussion is so well, I think it's been so well, you know, presented by so many people tonight. So thank you for giving people the tools, you know, the general public the tools and how to go about furthering this discussion. So Davis, thank you.
Okay, let's try this again. So is there any other comments, any other questions? So can we move to, I will accept the motion to recommend or not recommend Article 5.
Move to recommend Article 5, DePietro.
I need a second.
Second, Stebbins.
All right, I'm gonna go down the list, starting with DePietro.
Yes, DePietro.
Healy.
Healy, no.
Burville.
Burville, no.
Stebbins.
Stebbins, yes.
Stacy.
Stacy, no.
Temelio.
Temelio, no.
Vamosi.
Vamosi, yes.
And myself is a yes. That's 1, 2.
It is 4-4.
Connor, in a situation of a tie?
You have no action. So it's not an affirmative or a negative.
Can I make a point? Is there any interest within the committee to go back to my idea of recommending with amendment? And that would be in the amount of $23,000, which is what they were initially given as a middle ground between balancing our cost avoidance and, as I believe, and I believe Davis agreed, and I won't speak for anyone else, sorry, Davis, but I don't think our finance can be separated from our values, and I think that is a fair middle ground.
The question,
Can I just say,
Clarify that?
500 though. So
Sorry, well, so strike 54,500.
From what though, Jeremy?
From Article 5, so where it says to see if this town will vote to appropriate. No, never mind. The more to think about it, no. Never mind. Sorry.
Was there any other question to that on anyone else's? Davis, I see your hand is up. Is that up because you're? It's Zoom.
Sorry, it's up because I forgot to put it down. Sorry.
We're all in the Zoom world now. Okay, so you're pulling back from a potential amendment to that then. Okay.
Correct.
All right. So with that, we're on to Article 6, I believe. And I really appreciate all the questions that are coming in.
Hey, Patrick, I hate to do this, but we've been at it for 2 hours and I need to restore my biological comfort.
Oh yeah. Hey, this is a new situation.
Sorry.
Into, so hit it. We'll give him a moment.
I'm gonna refill my water.
Actually, this gives me an opportunity. We are moving on to Article 6. So if there are people that have questions that they want to ask about Article 6, you can obviously you can put them in now. I'm going to do the exact same thing I did before. I'm going to start at the top and go right down the list. If there are questions that are covering the same ground, roughly thematically, I will try to combine, just so we don't have to go through ad nauseum question after question that's effectively getting the same answer. I will say Nicole has a question in here. Nicole, it is about Article 7. We will definitely get to that. I haven't even read it yet, but we'll get to whatever your question is about Article 7 when we get there. But thank you for putting that in.
Patrick.
Yes.
This is unrelated, so I don't feel weird about quorum, but it's Hannah Toe, just for the record.
Pronunciation?
Pronunciation, yes.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Connor, this is there's a question that came in that's a point of information that we might be able to take during this time frame. Alexandra, I apologize. CalFeds, 83 Allen Road. Point of information: when you make a motion to recommend and the motion does not pass, the result is a motion that the Finance Committee did not recommend. Can you speak to that?
That's not my understanding of that, because not recommending is also an affirmative action. That if we assume the split was the same, the motion if the motion in second was to not recommend and it was 4-4,
Right.
the failure of that motion to carry would not be that we would then manually print that you did in fact affirmatively recommend. So you failed to recommend, but you did not by majority vote that you affirmatively do not recommend that funding. You could take a vote to do that. And if I'll double check with the clerk in the morning, and if I'm wrong, we'll clarify that in the warrant that's printed, Alexandra.
So real quick, Connor, so as of right now, your impression is that basically on town meeting day, next to finance committee, it'll just be a blank spot?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask another point of information?
Yes.
And that's a question to Patrick. Oh, totally lost that train of thought. Oh, if this, assuming we're going to have another meeting before town meeting to finalize these, is this mandated to come up again, can come up again, or cannot come up again?
That's a good question.
I assume it can.
I assume that it can't because we voted on it and did not reach a consensus.
Oh. Connor?
I'll have to check on that. I'm not positive.
Yeah,
my rules of order are a little bit dusty.
My skis in a lot of ways right now already. I don't want to play clerk.
Yeah, it's
for you.
Okay.
It's been a while since my debate club days, so I'm not 100% sure. But yeah,
I just didn't know if that was something you guys had off the top of your head. Sorry.
Yeah, no, sorry. We can investigate, and then if we do have that subsequent supplemental meeting right before town meeting to talk about the approval of the budget or anything else that comes up, then we can have that at that point.
I say we just blame that 9th member.
Where is John? Okay, we're all back. I think. Are we all back? We've got some cameras still off.
Jen and Tim are not.
Tim's there. What I'll do is, while we're waiting on Jen, I'll at least read through the article. She might be back.
I'm here.
Oh, there you are. Okay. Just wanted to make sure. I'm going to read through the article as per usual, and then we'll open it up for both internal and then subsequently external questions. Article 6, approve funding for Easton Patrol Officers Association contract. To see if the town will vote to raise and appropriate by transfer from available funds a sum of money needed to fund the incremental cost items contained in a collective bargaining agreement between the town and the Easton Patrol Officers Association. Such agreement to be effective July 1st, 2018 through June 30th, 2021, or take any other action relative thereto. Explanation, this article will fund the cost items of a new collective bargaining agreement with the Easton Patrol Officers Association for fiscal years 2019 through 2021. Funding for this article is available in a collective bargaining set aside, planned for this purpose, and carried in the fiscal 2020 budget as adopted by town meeting. If anyone else has any questions now, please feel free. I do have one question directly for Connor, which is more on the impact side.
I have a question, Patrick.
Yes.
I apologize. This is a very simple question. What does that mean? Like what costs are being, I assume what Connor is doing, sorry.
Yeah, so effectively my question is effectively more along the lines of what's the impact if this is not voted or approved by town meeting. Connor, if you want to give a little bit more background on this, that'd be obviously helpful.
Sure. Yeah, no, those are both good questions. So I'll try and touch on both. Under collective bargaining law in Massachusetts, under state law, with public employers like the town, we have to bargain with public sector unions over wages, benefits, things of that nature. And in Easton, we typically have 3-year contracts, 3 fiscal years. And the current contract round for we have 8 town unions. The police patrol is 1. There are 8 contracts, and the period of time is fiscal 19, 20, and 21. So we're heading into the final of the 3-year window. When a select board, through an administrator, negotiates a contract with a union, and they reach agreement in the process of good faith negotiations, it is put forward on a warrant to town meeting, and the select board recommends that forward to town meeting as the legislative body to fund the contract that they negotiated in good faith. And so this carries mine and the select board's recommendation, and that's why it's here. we've already done this. This is procedural for the other 7 unions. This was just, the agreement was reached last chronologically, and that's why it's here now. To Patrick's question, or actually Jeremy, to some more of your question as far as the funding, the town, as part of its ongoing strategic financial planning responsibilities, we know when these contract negotiation rounds are coming up, right? So we look at the market, we look at what other communities that are economically comparable to us are basically ending up with for wage agreements, and we basically set aside a small budget and carry that throughout the negotiations, so that if and when a resolution is reached, there is already funding accounted for and set aside somewhere, and so you don't need to take from another department to fund it, right? So in this case, the town purposefully and publicly identified what we called a collective bargaining reserve, and that was in our employee benefits and insurance budget, and identified that to town meeting for fiscal 19 and 20, and carried those funds for this exact purpose. And so what this article would do is move basically funds from one existing appropriation that was planned for this purpose to its final destination, which is in the police department. If, to Patrick's question, I think we've covered the procedure here that Finance Committee is free to take a yes or no recommendation on any article in the warrant, and that doing so doesn't impact or inhibit debate at town meeting. So I won't focus too much on that. The question about what happens if town meeting does not fund the article is that it basically sends you back to the drawing board. You don't then say, oh, okay, no contract, no obligation for salaries. You have to start over and renegotiate and do it again, and then come back again.
And to that point, Connor, as a follow-up to that, obviously fiscal prudency in this case would be would that money still stay in some sort of allocation fund to then reflect when a successful negotiation was completed to then pay for that?
Correct. It's already in that special account that is clearly identified on our budget sheet as a collective bargaining reserve, and it would be unwise planning. I wouldn't be doing my job even if it's failed to say, okay, well, let's just take that money and put it into the general fund, because you can't anticipate that you will eventually reach an agreement. We have a legal obligation to try in good faith to reach an agreement eventually, and there are usually cost items associated with that. In this case, it's already carried in the budget, and I think we're talking roughly $50,000.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? Jeremy.
Can you give me 2 questions? One, can you give me an example of what are the costs, I guess?
Sure. Yeah.
Is it negotiating itself?
Yeah. Do you want to, is there 2 questions? You want to do one at a time?
Yeah. My second question is, if this fails at town meeting, we reach another agreement, where does that money come from? Because I assume we'll still have that cost.
Right. So those are both good questions. So typically, and what this is it's related to wages. And when you negotiate with a group, regardless of the union, it is relatively common that there are what are called cost of living adjustments, right? So we have wage and compensation scales for all of our staff, non-union, union. That's good human resources practice. Those are public. All of our union contracts in full are on our website. And the cost items associated with it usually are pertinent overwhelmingly to those cost of living adjustments. And what that is basically an across the board adjustment to an existing salary scale that is negotiated over based on inflation and the cost of living, basically. So that's what the driver is here. And in this case, it's a 0-2-2 pattern. So no cost of living adjustment in 19, 2% in the next 2 years each, which is more conservative than most neighboring communities. So that's what drives that, those cost items. And then on the tail end of your question, yes, your assumption is accurate that if this were not voted by town meeting, the very likely eventual funding of an article doesn't go away. And if you hold that money still in the collective bargaining reserve, it doesn't go to anywhere else or help any other program or contract.
Where does it come from? Where would that, sorry if you answered that and I missed it. So like,
Yeah, so the collective bargaining reserve is like any other account that we appropriate funding to at town meeting from available revenue. And so that's what that was in 2019. And we, rather than pull from available revenue for contracts as they're ratified, because depending on the cost of living adjustment, depending on the size of the unit, these can be large numbers. You don't want to jeopardize your ability to fund departments. So it's good practice to set that money aside. So that money was set aside 2 years ago for this purpose. This just took longer to get to.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Thank you, Connor.
Thank you.
Let's see. Question from the attendees. Entail, 148 Randall Street. Did I say that right, Jeremy? Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you. Does this mean that we would be granting incremental funds to the police department employees when numerous school administrators, teachers, and staff have taken salary concessions for the next year?
Yes, but I need to expand on that question. This is basically pay for the existing, for the past, which were not the years that people took concessions. And to be clear, concessions were sought by all unions on the town and school side. And on the town side, our staff did concede almost $170,000 in wages, which is about 1% of our total government spending, which is enormous. So it's not an either or. You know, this isn't concessions from schools funding a police contract. There was concessions sought and given by administrators and personnel in the town government and in schools. So this is for funding those items for the fiscal 19 and 20.
Thank you. Well, any other questions from committee? Oh, we have one more. Andrew Abertson for Flint Lane. Would it not make sense for the committee to vote not to recommend so as to delay funding for union negotiations until the town body can vote on whether or not to cut additional funds from the police department? So Andrew, our voting not to recommend doesn't delay anything. It just is, it's our position on this warrant article before it then goes to town meeting. And town meeting can obviously vote not to recommend, but again, as Connor laid out, when that happens, the negotiation starts over. So it's a matter of, even if Connor, obviously check me here, even if there is a vote or some sort of process to cut additional funds from the police department, this negotiation is essentially still happening in that existing allocated fund for, again, the past, right? This is previously served time and effort that these people have done, and just the agreement itself has not been finalized.
Correct. And yeah, that's correct. You know, as far as is it, you know, virtuous to delay, this already took 2 years. And if you started over, it just then you're running up the clock of when you eventually say it takes 2 more years. You have a group without a contract for 4 years. And if an agreement is reached, then instead of a $50,000 movement of funds from a 2-year-old appropriation to square up a deal, bargain in good faith, you're dealing with 4 years of back pay. So I would not advise that. And it's separate, Patrick, to your question of union contracts must be negotiated regardless of the total funding level that town meeting sets for any department. So though they're not mutually exclusive. It's not fund a union contract, therefore you can't you know, make decisions about appropriating fewer dollars. Those are not mutually exclusive.
Right. And to that point, Andrew, you just asked a secondary question, which I believe Connor did just answer, that is not mutually exclusive. So thank you for that. David.
Yeah, sorry, just real quick to make sure that I'm understanding, Connor. So basically what you're saying is, like, you know, the contract will basically say, you know, a police officer working this many hours will get paid this much. And agreeing on that does not preclude the town from saying, well, you know, at that rate, we will have like fewer officers. Like, is that a fair kind of summary of what you're saying?
Yeah, so obviously you try to align your collective bargaining strategy with your financial resources. But yes, we have a contractual obligation to pay all staff what their contracts state we will. And if the budget the total budget cannot sustain the level of personnel, then you need to cut the budget either through expenses or by reducing personnel, which again, unfortunately, we are in that posture across the board in the town and school governments, not as a result of one union negotiation or as another, but because we're looking at one of the worst revenue forecasts that we've ever seen in our history.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Jamie, is that a question or are you just, no, it's just a hand up. Okay.
No.
Any other questions on this?
There's another one in the Q&A.
It's, to be fair, it's belaboring the same point. The discussion of morality, the question is talking about the morality of the town body firing someone after negotiating a contract with them, which is not, I don't think, tangentially related to the fact of ratifying a contract negotiation that is completed, in my opinion. So.
Okay, given that I don't see a way, if we vote this down, it doesn't change anything. It just means we owe them more money in the future. We're contractually obligated to. I'm going to make a motion to recommend.
Can I get a second?
Second, DePietro.
DePietro. All right, let's go to the list. DePietro.
Yes, DePietro.
Healy.
Healy, yes.
Verville.
Verville, yes.
Stebbins.
Stebbins, yes.
Stacy.
Stacy, yes.
Camelio.
Camelio, yes.
Mimosi.
Mimosi, yes.
And myself, Helen, is a yes. So that is voted to recommend. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, attendees. Moving on to Article 7. So I'm going to read Article 7. I alluded to this before, but as we do not have a final number, we do not have the final, the budget itself is not final. We will not be taking this one up tonight. We'll be moving on to 8. There is at least one question in here that I want to address, and there might be additional questions about the operating budget that we can touch into. Article 7, fiscal year 2021 operating budget. To see if the town will vote to raise and appropriate, transfer from any available source of funds, borrow, or bond to defray the department and incidental expenses of the town not otherwise provided for the fiscal year commencing on July 1st, 2020, or take any other action relative thereto. Explanation. This is the annual operating budget for the town. Due to the economic uncertainty wrought by COVID-19, the fiscal year 2021 operating budget is not final at the time of this warrant's printing. The final balanced budget will be published online at www.easton.ma.us and presented to the select board in advance of town meeting. Copies of the balanced budget will be made available to voters the night of town meeting as well, where the budget will be presented. So there's not a lot of conversation really necessary on our side to be had around this, because obviously we don't have final numbers. This is still in process. Connor, do you have anything you want to say here? I could obviously go through and speak a little bit more about it before answering this question, but I just wanted to give you an opportunity.
I think it's important that we be mindful of the proximity of town meeting, that the budget is not balanced. We're a few $100,000 out, but we started with projections of being 2.8 million out. We're getting very close. And the finance committee did have this presented to everyone in mid-May, right? And a lot has changed since then. We obviously copy you on all iterations of this budget. All iterations of this budget are presented on what's now basically a weekly basis. But although it's not final, I'm not asking for you to take a recommendation one way or another. You have me here. If you have questions, I'm happy to try to help with that.
Thank you. Anyone else on the committee that wants to ask a question, speak? Okay. Nicole DiCenzo, 1 Janine Drive. Regarding Article 7, sorry for jumping ahead to Article 7, but I feel like my comment is relevant to this entire conversation. This, to be fair, Nicole, this isn't really a question. I'm going to jump ahead past the comment side of this to get to sort of more of the question aspect of it, which is effectively, can a $390,000 cut be made from the EPD and reinvested into education and community health services? This funding should support alternatives to policing, removing the burden on EPD as the initial response to community and health crisis, and instead reflect to public safety by funding mental health specialists, psychologists, and trauma-informed crisis intervention specialists to dispatch and have within schools. So the finance committee should not recommend Article 7. So I appreciate the point. I think this speaks back to the point that both myself and Connor made earlier, which is for our committee to recommend or not recommend, in some cases is obviously part of a policy discussion, but not necessarily the discussion that creates policy. And this is very much a policy push, right? This is something where this is a very key, I don't want to say ask, it's a key suggestion of some differences that could be done within the town and the town budgeting and the town process to potentially have a different outlook on how policing or mental health or both from a public safety standpoint are accomplished within Easton. And so this is one of those ones where I think that there is a need to have this kind of conversation. This is something where this is something to bring up at the select board. This is something to bring up obviously at places like town meeting in these discussion moments to have this type of additional conversation, an additional weigh-in from people that do make the policy. Because if we're not even voting on this tonight, so it's a matter of we're not going to recommend or not recommend tonight because we don't have the final numbers yet. We're pretty close. But if this is something that is more of that policy piece, then I highly recommend you go through that channel and get this in front of the people that can incorporate that into changes that the town may or may not adopt, right? Because again, even if this process starts with select board, let's say, for instance, and goes through a variety of different discussions, communications, meetings, et cetera, makes it to something that's like a warrant article or an ask, that's something that can be brought up throughout this entire process. And it's valuable to have that type of insight and opinion. If anyone else wants to speak on that, I obviously open the floor to anyone else who would like to speak. Tim, I saw your hand.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. To that point, I wanted to bring up I see a lot of names on the attendees list here today that I also saw the school committee list. I want to say thank you to you guys for coming out to both of those meetings because they're both the places to be, and that's where the action takes place. And again, I think, to the second part of our question about getting services into schools and how we can take this crisis and make some positive changes out of it and continue to fund those programs that will continue change in a positive direction. I think the school committee had a great discussion. So for the folks who were there, thank you for being there and being a part of it. For the folks who weren't there or may not have seen that school committee discussion, I highly recommend taking into it. It's a meeting similar to this one. It's a longer meeting, but well worth the viewing. In there, you're also going to see the school budget side of things and what the school committee's been working on in there. If anybody has specific questions, I'm happy to get into it. I know it's a long night, and again, I just can't recommend highly enough that the work that the school committee did the other night with their meeting as well. So definitely tune in if you haven't seen it.
Thank you, Tim. Anyone else? Oh, Davis, sorry, I missed you there.
No worries. I just wanted to ask Connor, I seem to recall that as part of the ongoing considerations of how the town was going to handle the uncertainty around, what state aid is going to look like, which ultimately affects our budget. I think I remember at some point there being maybe a mention of updated budget warrant articles occurring maybe earlier than they usually do, like in the fall. I was just curious if you could speak to what the current view is on if we would be voting again in like the near future to update our budget numbers.
Sure. So I will speak for myself and the town departments because that's my purview. I won't speak for the schools necessarily, except to echo what Tim's saying and commend them for the relatively brutal task that's at hand. Yes, we typically have a town meeting in the spring, and it normally is in May. The only reason it's in June is because there was a pandemic. We also usually have a town meeting in the fall, and you do that for a variety of reasons, to make amendments to things and to clean up anything you couldn't get to at the town meeting. And so I think it's reasonable to expect that, adopting the budget that I eventually put forward is not the last step, it's the first. We're heading into an unknown. We don't know, we still don't know, and we will not know. But the state of Massachusetts has stated they will not have a budget projection for fiscal 21 until we're in fiscal 21, right? So to your point, Davis, and I think it's worth the folks tuning in knowing, state aid isn't some rounding error. It's 12 to 13 million dollars of the 80 that we need to run the government and run the schools. And so a percent variance matters a lot. You're talking numerous jobs. So we don't know, and we will not know. We know they will not have a budget until fiscal 21, but we don't know when that will be. It could be August, it could be December, it could be the spring. Wendy, we have the benefit of Wendy's experience. Wendy was the finance director here during the Great Recession. And one of the things we need to keep our eye on, you ask about budget amendments in the fall. Yes, our budget is going to be in flux for years, probably. Because when these major economic downturns happen, the sad reality is that most media attention, most news attention is paid to how the Dow Jones is doing and what private jobs numbers look like. It is not usually part of the American dialogue on, gee, how's the public sector doing, right? And it should be, obviously. These are people who provide critical services. The last time we had a recession, which was in 2008, it took 2 years before job growth from the private sector returned, but it took 5 years before tax revenue to the state returned. And it took 8 years before our revenue from the state recovered. So these are multi-year downturns. And even if in this case, in the coronavirus recession, the general economy begins to recover sooner, we're starting from a pit that none of us have seen in our lifetime. More jobs have been lost in the past 2 months in the United States than in the entire 2 years of the Great Recession. It's almost hard to calculate, right? So we're going to be dealing with the changes of this for a very long time. From a policy perspective, from a programming perspective, we don't yet know. Standards are still evolving on everything we do, from playground use to pools to schools. And the science is still evolving on COVID. So there's going to be, we're entering an unbelievable time of change. So not the least of which is that our budget will be in flux. We don't know what state aid looks like. We don't know what our receipts will look like by year end, right? We can probably count on that our free cash is going to be hit pretty hard, right? So that's going to weaken our ability to use reserve spending in fiscal 22 to support the schools and to support the towns. This is going to be a multi-year, incredibly difficult time. I'm not trying to be doom and gloom for anyone, but I think it's really important that folks understand the scale of the challenge we're facing, because it's only in the face of such unbelievable, almost unfathomable economic challenges that we would consider the cuts we're making. No one gets into this line of work. No one runs for finance committee or school committee or select board to cut budgets and to say, let's get rid of this program and this program. It's an awful thing to do. There was a question about morality. It's terrible. Laying people off is awful. Losing a job is one of the most traumatic things people go through in their life. And it's a tough and difficult time. So yes, in the fall, perhaps sooner, we don't know yet. We will know more, and we're going to need to be making adjustments and trying to be a lot more nimble on these things than you normally would with an annual budget for an $80-something million organization, because there's just so much we still don't know. And a lot of people may not assume this, but we in local government, in the schools, we frequently find out the new standards for how things will be done. Parks are safe or they're not, the day you do. And sometimes if we're lucky, we get a couple days heads up. So we're trying to react to, and so things are going to be in flux. So if we get to a point and folks look at the budget that's balanced, a balanced budget doesn't mean mission accomplished, crisis averted, everything's good. It just means that the revenue equals the expense. And we're gonna have a lot of work to do in the coming months. And the question about, doesn't it make sense to reallocate from one department to another for a programmatic change? It may. But that's a major policy shift that if the town's going to do, we owe to everyone, including the people receiving services, to make sure that we do so with thoughtful policy analysis, which takes some time. And so things will be changing, even once the budget's balanced, even if it's adopted as presented. Sorry that was so long-winded, but the answer is yes.
Thank you, Connor.
Tim.
Connor, I have two more questions for you. I apologize. They should be straightforward though. The first question I have is, I was hoping you could lend a little bit of clarification. I know I tuned into the select board meeting and saw we had some discussion on COVID refunds, money that was coming back from emergency relief. However, I wanted you to clarify what that can be used for. I know the newspaper kind of puts it out there, and a little bit of clarification for everybody I think would be great. The second question I have is, I've been trying to keep up with the changing legislation as it relates to town meeting, budgetary process and those kinds of things. And that's been changing as of, 4 days ago as well. Would you mind just covering a few of those changes, how they'll impact town meeting, and how they may impact the allocation of funds that we have right now?
So the shorter question is about legislation relating to town meeting. Legislation was adopted by the state to give cities or towns, not cities, they don't have town meeting, but towns, more flexibility in town meetings to delay them longer and farther, and to reduce the amount of people who need to be there to vote. And the idea there is that you want to create an environment where people can conduct the town's business safely and keep their distance. So we're going to have it at Stonehill in a giant field house that's sized for 5,000 people, so that even if everyone's keeping their distance really, really well, we could fit a couple hundred folks. There is the option for the town to engage in what's called 1/12 budgeting. That's something school districts have by default in state law, but it's now been extended to municipal government, where the select board could delay town meeting for any number, a variety of reasons, of financial uncertainty, health concerns, into the next fiscal year. And we would basically end up with just a 0% level fund budget across the board. That is not tremendously far off from where our budget will end up anyway, because we have effectively we have about 1% of new revenue to work with. So that's the town meeting question. As far as for voters, we'll be publishing through the clerk's office the Know Before You Go guide, helping people feel safe and comfortable from a health perspective, wearing masks, of course. We'll have health staff working there, the CERT team and things like that, keeping people physically apart and stuff like that, so people can safely exercise their right to vote. I forgot your first question.
No problem. Thank you for the clarification on that one. The first question was just, I know a lot of people in the public may have seen the article relating to the COVID relief funds coming back to town. Would you just clarify what those funds are, how they can be used, and how they relate to the budget?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So there is a lot of media attention on the CARES Act, which was a 2.2 trillion with a T stimulus package passed by the United States government that did include $150 billion in relief for cities and towns. And on the surface, you read that and say, awesome, problem solved, we're going to be okay. However, there are significant restrictions for use of that money. Most critically of which is that we, as frustrating as this is, Easton has a $2.2 million check with its name on it somewhere up in Boston. And we have a $2.8 million revenue problem. You are not allowed to use that federal money to offset revenue shortfalls. So that would be tremendously helpful, and this conversation would be significantly less painful, but you can't do it. There's conversation happening about loosening that, and people in jobs like mine work with the Mass Municipal Association, the Select Board, the Finance Committee, School Committee. People are advocating to our lawmakers to try to put pressure on the United States to loosen the requirements there, so that that money can be more helpful and help keep people working and providing services to our community. What the money can be used for now is for unanticipated costs you incur while fighting COVID, because we have been, and I don't need to tell you this, Tim, on the front line of that in local government, on the pandemic response, on purchasing the personal protective equipment for the fire department, for police, for folks showing up on scene to help people who are sick, and that costs money. So thankfully, we are able to access federal relief for that. Similarly, the schools are able to access that funding for unanticipated costs. but not to offset the critical revenue shortfall we have. So that's a distinction that usually is not covered in that detail. You know, you just see the headline 2.2 trillion, everyone's got money. And then you come to a budget meeting, you're like, what is wrong with these people? Like, why can't they balance the budget? There's restrictions on that money, unfortunately, that prohibit us from using it to fix the very real problem we're all talking about. I do think there is other federal legislation. You know, part of this, we're talking about how do people get engaged and change policy on the local level. These things are all interrelated, and it's, you know, a spaghetti mess of federalism, of federal government, state government, county government, municipal government. But on the federal level, there's an additional bill I believe has passed the House and is, I think, stalled in the Senate, I'm not sure, called the HEROES Act, which I think is a $3 trillion bill. Tim, you're usually pretty in touch with these things. You probably know more than me. That is targeted specifically to supporting revenue for police, fire, teachers across the United States. But that has stalled. Tim, is that your assessment as well?
No, that's great. No, it's hoping you to bring up those points. You know, like I said, it's not with a light heart that we take a look at the discussions that we're having, and I see a lot of similar names and faces at many of these meetings. And the question is, once we have these meetings here, where do we go from there? And I think you just pointed out two areas, one being the upcoming town meeting, which is a great way to really take on everything we've discussed here tonight at the local level, but also not to stop there, but to continue that all the way to your federal level with your congressmen and your senators, and engage them as well in the same process as you do as a local. And as you said, it's not an easy thing. It's going to take time. It's going to take sacrifice of time. You know, I think you pointing those two things out was very helpful. And I hope to see these same faces with us as we continue the fight. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim and Connor. Any other questions from the committee or statements, asks? Davis.
Sorry, real quick, Connor. My experience with federal funding is so I'm so used to the FEMA, you know, the FEMA funding that we get years and years and years after a given storm for which we're eligible for reimbursement. Right. Just to follow up quickly on what Tim said, do you know? So you said that the 2.2 million, that's very exclusively for the you know, unanticipated COVID costs, is sitting at the Capitol. I guess this is kind of a little bit of crystal ball reading, but, you know, would you anticipate that a larger act that just gave us, you know, like non-conditional spending, do you think that would be more of a we're eligible for reimbursement several years later type of thing?
So the timing of fund availability is obviously super important, and the United States did the right thing here, that they got this money out quick and it's available now. The problem isn't that we have to wait 5 years for it, it's that the restrictions are on it. So, you know, we asked for our first portion of that, and we're relatively conservative in doing so. It's spread out over 2 fiscal years. So we asked for 390,000. That leaves about 1.9 in the tank, so to speak, because there's going to be all sorts of unanticipated needs, particularly in the schools in the fall. So we're trying to be conservative and have that there to help us out in 21, and also to try and be hopeful that perhaps the United States loosens some of the restrictions on use. And if so, then we would have the opportunity to tie this all the way back to your first question about a fall town meeting, to perhaps use some of that to help with the major revenue problems we're talking about.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, we have two very good questions that just came in from Hanato, 148 Randall Street. Is it still possible to make requests for changes in the budget? What obligations does the town have to listen to demands of citizens on transferring funds from one department to another? This is more of a procedural question for town meeting, but it's something that we've seen in the past. Connor, I'd love for you to weigh in on what that looks like in reality.
Sure. So from a technical standpoint, the answer is any voter can go to town meeting and propose amendments or changes to the budget. As far as what the town's obligation is to listen to demands of citizens, it depends. If a citizen who's a voter goes to town meeting and makes their case and persuades their neighbors and the majority votes that way, then that's the obligation. The town has a budget that's voted by town meeting. outside of that, for the broader conversation about like, well, what about setting priorities? You want to contact the select board at the emails I gave earlier. You can email me and I'll get you in touch with them. C-Read, C-R-E-A-D at easton.ma.us. We have meetings throughout the year where we iterate on our budgets and lay out, as I did on May 18th. This is the challenge we're facing, and these are what the relative priorities are. And the public has an opportunity to talk about that at the time. The board members have an opportunity to talk about that at the time and weigh in with their feedback. So you could do it one of two ways. The formal way is go to town meeting and try to debate what you think is best and persuade people to make changes there. And the other is to go to some of the more ongoing meetings of the select board and of the budget subcommittee and of the school committee. Those are the groups that talk really about the kind of policy priorities for where funding will go. To be fully transparent, as far as town meeting is concerned, town meeting appropriates money. Town meeting does not, town meeting can't appropriate money and have it automatically convert to some kind of program. Policy and programming is the prerogative of the select board and the people that they appoint, like me, to put in place. And, you know, we were, to Roberta's point earlier, we were on the exact opposite end of this conversation a couple of years ago in the wake of Parkland, where we had a really challenging conversation at town meeting. And exactly this came up. I think, Hannah, you asked this question. Some people came to town meeting and demanded that we spend more on police and that we take more money from our reserve funds and put it in the police department and hire more police officers and have more school resource officers. And, you know, the chief and I and the superintendent and the voters of the town had a long and thoughtful conversation about that. But one of the key points there is that even if town meeting does that, say town meeting moved the funding into the department and said, hire another police officer, the executive branch of the town, which is the select board and may appoint me for day-to-day, has no obligation to hire that officer. That's a managerial decision. And if people dislike that, they tell the select board. And if they dislike it greatly, they can hold them accountable by voting them out. But that's kind of the way our different branches of government work. So the technical answer is town meeting is the forum to make your case and try to persuade neighbors to change budget amounts. But more generally, and it is a big ask and it is a hurdle for engagement, stay engaged and come to meetings and learn about these processes. Typically in a normal year when we don't have a pandemic, we start issuing preliminary budgets usually around January. So they're pretty standard items on select board, school committee, and finance committee and budget subcommittee agendas for about 5 months of every year leading into May. So I hope that was helpful.
And Connor, you actually unknowingly answered another question that came in at the same time, which is from Andrew Abramson for Flint Lane. What specific meetings should we go to other than town meeting if we want to advocate for changes to the budget, which is exactly what you just laid out, right? So the budget subcommittee, finance committee, select board, and
capital planning.
And capital planning. Those meetings are going to be the places where, to Connor's point, there's a lot more opportunity, especially early in the year, to have these types of discussions and to have those points be raised and thus obviously debated and discussed on.
And just one last note on that. We just named 5 committees, right? So it's like, oh, okay, let me put that on my dance card for the next year. If you don't know where to go, you can email me and I'll connect you with the right place. And sometimes that right place might just be meeting with me and telling me what you think. And that's okay too.
Thank you. Any other comments, questions on 7 before we move on? Seeing none. Article 8, to see fiscal 2021 capital budget. To see if the town will vote to raise and appropriate by borrowing or appropriate by transfer from available funds, a sum of money for the purpose of meeting the capital budget needs of the town for fiscal year 2021 as follows. Fire and rescue ambulance, $350,000. Fire and rescue defibrillators, $34,000. Fire and rescue protective clothing, $8,334. Fire and rescue mobile data terminals, $11,200. Fire and rescue station number 3 sewer tie-in, $50,000. School wastewater treatment plant, replace sewer pumps and drives, $35,000. Water PFAS preparedness study, wells 1, 2, and 4, $110,000. Water treatment plant design and engineering, $1 million. Water main replacement repair for Pond Street, Queesit Brook, Black Book Road, $950,000. Total $2,548,534, or take any other action relative thereto. Explanation: this is the annual capital budget for the town and has been limited to health and safety items and enterprise projects, which are funded separately from taxation. Funding sources are borrowing and available funds. Questions, comments?
Patrick. Hannah Toe asked a question right before we moved on, but we didn't catch it. Can we just answer that quickly?
Sure. Hannah Toe, 148 Reynolds Street. So if an amendment at the town meeting votes to reallocate police funds to the schools, does that still mean the town has no obligation to actually make additional hires at the school? Effectively, based on past experience, if funds are reallocated to the school has the ability to decide what to do with that capital.
Correct. And that decision is made through the school committee and the superintendent.
This was the exact situation that was raised with the SRO,
Correct.
and that Dr. Cabral said, like, you could vote for this, but if the decision of the board and the administration is that we do not need an SRO, we're going to go with this other project or this other need, then that's at their purview. It's not something the town meeting has direct connection to, which is exactly what Connor just said about the administrative side of things. Thank you, Hannah. Sorry, so back to 8. Davis.
Can I give my little capital planning committee spiel for the uninitiated?
Hit it.
Okay, so you've probably picked up by now, it's come up a couple times. Basically, the capital planning committee is a specific group that's tasked with considering requests over a certain amount, $25,000. And so, again, you know, if you guys were able to get into the normal process at the beginning, you would have been able to attend the capital planning committee meetings where we considered all the requests from the departments and where we prioritized what we're going to spend on. You know, so for example, that the issue with the police cruisers, you know, if you had wanted to argue against that, a good place to go would have been to the capital planning committee meeting where we discussed that and, you know, basically said, hey, I think that this should be prioritized like way at the end and that there are other, you know, things that are more deserving of capital funds. And so that's to speak to, you know, the point that Connor was making about other meetings you can go to, that's definitely a big one. And let me just click over to a different tab real quick. I might have to let go of my space bar. Hold on. Okay, so the way the capital planning committee makes these prioritizations is we actually are mandated our order. The top priority is imminent threat to the health and safety of citizens or property. Second priority is improvement of a capital asset to facilitate maintenance of operations, not to include ordinary maintenance. And basically this is the avoid costly expenditure in the future. 3 is requirement of state or federal law or regulation. 4 is improvement of infrastructure. 5 is improvement of productivity. 6 is alleviation of an overburdened situation. We would be in dreamland if we could even make it to like 3. Typically, our entire capital budget just gets spent on 1, curbing imminent, you know, threats to health, and 2, trying to avoid future significant costs. And so to that end, you know, usually to address what I'm sure will be a specific question, you know, in the fall meeting, Chief Sullivan, whose name I will be getting right from now on, basically said, you know, we need the cruisers because the cruisers are part of the maintenance of the health and safety of citizens and property. And the committee agreed. And so to give people, you know, who are asking questions about prioritization, you know, this is definitely a place where we would look for input for people to say, you know, I don't think you know, getting police cruisers would help the imminent threats to health and safety of citizens and property as much as diverting that to like mental health counseling in the schools or, you know, emergency services. So all that being said, what you see in front of you is even pared down from like our pared down priorities. And Wendy can speak a little more to it if there's a question, but basically I mean, you don't even see the police cruisers on this one. We had to cut down to truly stuff that we are like, people's health will be in danger, you know, people's lives will be at risk. That is as far out of the 6 prioritization steps as we made it. We hardly even made it past point number 1. And all of this is just a demonstration of the ongoing issue of, these really tight budgets. And since we're spending our free cash on the operational budget, we can't spend it on like one-time capital expenses instead, which would be a good use for it. Hopefully that can give people a little bit of a background of how the capital side works and how those prioritizations came about.
Thank you, Davis. Committee questions, comments? We do have one from the audience. Andrew Abramson for Flint Lane. Why was more money not put into solving the PFAS filter issue and funds to pay for everyone in Easton to have a proper filter? Personally, I think Davis did a good job of effectively answering that question, but I'll open that up to Connor and Davis if there's anything you want to share to that ask.
So Andrew, that's a great question, and there's two pieces to it. One is about home filters, right? And that's outside of the town's spending. We can't go buy filters for people's houses. But what we did do, which was try to do the next best thing, was we rolled out last year, well in advance of any regulation requiring anything like this, just because it was the right thing to do, a rebate program for folks who do buy a home PFAS filter. That you can access that program. It's on our website. Go to the water division page. So we can't buy that for folks, but we can rebate their water bill a certain amount of money if they did buy one for themselves, if that was an immediate concern for them and their family. As far as the capital question, the reason why it's not more money is because this is the money we need to spend just to find out how much money we need to spend. Basically, we need to go through a engineering process to thoroughly evaluate. We have multiple wells. I think it's either 6 or 7. Not all of them have tested at PFAS rates that are at or above the DEP regulation for that. But our wells are spaced out in a way that we can't just build one treatment plant and kind of plop it somewhere in town and have every well that we draw water from get treated. So part of this is the first step, and we prioritized it now so that we could do the necessary engineering studies to identify which wells need what type of treatment and what type of treatment plant and facilities do you need to build. And you take that, you get a scope of service, you get a good grip on what does that cost, and you program that in a successive capital budget as soon as you have that information, so that you can take the right steps to deal with that. And the select board's also the water commission, and the sewer commission and the rent control board. So we're really getting into the weeds here, but they did raise water rates earlier this year to build up revenue capacity so that we could fund not only studies like this, but the necessary capital costs that are going to come with what are probably $10+ million treatment plants. So this is a first step.
Okay. Any other questions, anything else relevant to Article 8? Okay, seeing none, I'm going to ask for a motion.
Healy, motion to recommend.
In a second.
Evans, second.
All right, DePietro.
Yes, DePietro.
Healy.
Healy, yes.
Burville.
Burville, yes.
Stebbins.
Stebbins, yes.
Stacy.
Stacy, yes.
Melio.
Melio, yes.
Ramosi.
Ramosi, yes.
And myself is a yes. That is recommended. All right, moving on to Article 9. Article 9 is a bit of a read, so I'm going to go through it. Article 9, acceptance of statutes relating to veterans. To see if the town will vote to accept the following provisions of the Massachusetts General Laws. MGL Chapter 59, Section 5, Clause 22nd G, inserted by Chapter 218 of the Acts of 2018, known as an act relative to veterans' benefits, rights, appreciation, validation, and enforcement, the BRAVE Act, signed into law August 28, 2018, which provides for a property tax exemption for any real estate that is the domicile of a person, but is owned by a trustee, conservator, or other fiduciary for the person's benefit if the real estate would be eligible for exemption under Clause 22nd, 22nd A, 22nd B, 22nd C, 22nd D, E, or F, if the person were the owner of the real estate or take any other action relative thereto. Number 2, MGL Chapter 59, Section 5, Clause 22nd H, inserted by Chapter 218 of the Acts of 2018, known as the Act Relative to Veterans Benefits, Rights, Appreciation, Validation, and Enforcement, the Brave Act again, signed into law August 28, 2018, which provides for a property tax exemption for real estate to the full amount of the taxable valuation of the real property of the surviving parents or guardians of soldiers and sailors and members of the National Guard and veterans who, one, during active duty service suffered an injury or illness documented by the United States Department of Veteran Affairs or a branch of the armed forces that was a proximate cause of their death, or two, are missing in action with the presumptive finding of death as a result of active duty services as members of the armed forces of the United States, provided, however, that the real estate shall be occupied by the surviving parents or guardian as the surviving parents or guardian's domicile, and provided further that the surviving parents or guardians shall have been domiciled in the Commonwealth for the 5 consecutive years immediately before the date of filing for an exemption pursuant to this clause, or the soldier or sailor, member of the National Guard or veteran was domiciled in the Commonwealth for not less than 6 months before entering service. Surviving parents or guardians eligible for an exemption pursuant to this clause shall be eligible regardless of when the soldier, sailor, member of the National Guard, or veteran died or became missing in action with the presumptive finding of death, provided, however, that the exemption shall only apply to tax years beginning on or after January 1st, 2019. Such exemptions shall be available until such time as the surviving parents or guardians are deceased. No real estate shall be so exempt which has been conveyed to the surviving parents or guardians to evade taxation. 3, MGL Chapter 60, Section 3F, which establishes a voluntary donation to Municipal Veterans Assistance Fund, pre-existing Veterans Discretionary Fund, by designation on municipal property tax or motor vehicle excise bills, or take any other action relative thereto. Explanation. The intended purposes of the first part of this article is to expand real estate property tax relief via exemption available to qualifying veterans who would have already been eligible for such exemption under the clauses mentioned above, even if said veterans have conveyed the property to a trust. The town of Easton will receive partial and in some cases a full reimbursement from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for each exemption if adopted. The intended purposes of the second part of this article is to grant a full exemption for property tax to Gold Star parents or guardians of soldiers and sailors, members of the National Guard and veterans who have died or are missing in action presumed dead. The town of Easton will not receive reimbursement for this exemption for the Commonwealth. Acceptance of the statute referenced in the third part of this article allows for the town to designate a place on its municipal property tax bills or motor vehicle excise bills, or mail with such bills a separate form whereby taxpayers of the city, town, or district may voluntarily check off, donate, and pledge an amount of money which shall increase the amount already due to establish and fund a Municipal Veterans Assistance Fund, which will be under the supervision of the local Veterans Agent and Select Board in accordance with the board's existing Veterans Discretionary Fund policy. Any amounts donated to the fund shall be deposited into a special account in the General Treasury and shall be in the custody of the Treasurer. Money in the fund shall be used to provide support for veterans and their dependents in need of immediate assistance with food, transportation, heat, and oil expenses. The Veterans Service Officer, under the general direction of the Department of Health and Community Services, shall 1. Establish an application process for veterans and their dependents to obtain assistance, 2. Establish standards for acceptable documentation of veteran status or dependent status, and 3. Establish financial eligibility criteria for determining need and amount of assistance for eligible applicants. The Veterans Service Office shall not be responsible for reviewing each applicant and fairly applying the eligibility and level of needs standards. Shall be responsible. I apologize, not shall not be responsible. Comments, questions, discussion. Tim.
I just wanted to comment on this one. Actually, I wanted to make a couple of comments. One is I wanted to thank our Veteran Service Officer, Corey, for doing a fantastic job over the past few months. I know I've said it in the previous meetings about everybody who's been stepping up and doing a lot of things. Corey's taken on a lot of responsibilities and done a lot of great things for the veterans in our community. As a fellow veteran, I can't support this particular article enough. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Davis?
I was just curious if either Connor or Wendy had like any kind of like estimate as to what the numbers like after implementing this might look like.
Yeah, that's a good question. And so just to be clear, that's a lot of legalese and jargon, but basically this is a series of state laws that town meetings can adopt that are meant to provide some amount of financial relief to veterans and the surviving Gold Star parents of veterans who've died in service to the country. And these were brought forward last year in November. They started being drafted as a way to provide a good faith financial relief mechanism for folks who have financial difficulties in the veteran community in response to the fact that we were at that time pushing for, which then the community overwhelmingly voted for, a debt exclusion override to fund the new early elementary school, which would create an additional tax burden for people. The net that the VSO Corey has estimated is approximately 75, roughly 32,000 of revenue impact total, which is about 1/20th of 1% of revenue.
Thank you, Connor. And just to echo what Tim said, and thank you, Tim, for that. Yeah, Corey does an excellent job, and so hopefully we can pass our thanks on to him for his work on this.
And Tim, thank you for your service.
Agreed. Yeah, just to echo what's already been said, I think this is a fantastic article. Like, this is something that is in the discussions we had around the time of the school override and debt exclusion. The discussion around this was more for, you know, what can we do from an option for people to pledge money, donate money, etc. And to see it expanded into this is very inspiring. So, Corey, thanks to everyone associated. If there's no other questions, we have nothing from the attendees. I'm
recommend DePietro.
Thank you, Mike. Do I have a second?
Second, Stebbins.
Thank you. All right, let's go down the list. DePietro.
DePietro, yes.
Healy.
Healy, yes.
Virgil.
Verville, yes.
Stebbins.
Stebbins, yes.
Stacy.
Stacy, yes.
Camelio.
Camelio, yes.
Mimosi. I think you're on mute. I know what you're going to say, but officially. That's a thumbs up, which is, I assume, a yes, because you can't get off mute. And myself is a yes. Thank you, everyone. On to Article 10. Okay, Article 10, report and fiscal year 2021 budget of the Community Preservation Committee. To see if the town will vote to act on the report of the Community Preservation Committee on the fiscal year 2021 Community Preservation budget, and to appropriate or reserve for later appropriation monies from Community Preservation Fund annual revenues or available funds for the administrative expenses of the Community Preservation Committee, the payment of debt service, the undertaking of community preservation projects, and all other necessary and proper expenses for the year, or take any other action relative thereto. Proposed fiscal year 2021 Community Preservation budget appropriations are administrative expenses of $77,500, debt service of $513,363, Affordable Housing Trust Fund of $500,000. For reserves, we're looking at the historic reserves of $155,000 and the annual budgeted reserve of $304,137. Explanation, this article proposes the fiscal year 2021 budget for the Community Preservation Committee, which includes funding of the Affordable Housing Trust's activities for fiscal year 2021. The trust works to implement the goals and strategies of Easton's state-mandated housing production plan and to provide resources and affordable housing options to low and moderate income residents. Fiscal year 2021 activities will include funding of the Home Buyer Assistance Program, support for creation of a group housing for acquired brain injury individuals on Foundry Street, support for a nonprofit developer to create affordable family housing on Electric Avenue, Quanticoat Avenue, and Morse Road, and support for planning work and related administration for the town to meet its Chapter 40B requirements. At least $250,000 of this amount will fund a short-term emergency rental assistance grant program for low-income households in Easton in response to the COVID-19 induced recession and associated economic hardships. Amounts to be funded shall be considered separate appropriations. I open it up to questions and comments. Connor.
I'd just make one quick note for the few folks who held on into hour 4 of this, that the CPA budget is a separate budget that uses funds that are separately collected as a surtax on property tax that cannot be used on departments. Because again, this is one of those things people look at the budget challenge and they're like, what are you doing over here? You're spending $2 million. What's wrong with you? This is a fund developed by state law that voters had to affirmatively adopt, that is a 3% surcharge on the existing tax bill that goes into a special account that can only be used for historic preservation, recreation, affordable housing, and open space acquisition. And those are all important functions of what makes Easton Easton. And this is an annual article. But what's unique here is that there have been some restrictions on CPA funds loosened by the state in response to the horrible economic crisis, where communities can adopt basically an emergency rent relief program to help keep people in their homes. And so the planning department here has already been working on that, and they're hopefully going to have an interim plan rolling out soon to help people. And this would be a way, again, for funds that are targeted and they cannot be used in department budgets, can't be used for operations or capital with limited exception. This would help members of our community make ends meet while suffering from COVID.
Thank you for the clarification, Connor. Davis, you had your hand up.
Yep, I just want to quickly say, having had a lot of discussion tonight about our role in addressing racial and economic inequality, these funds are a huge part of what the town can do very directly to influence that. I mean, affordable housing and rental assistance are going to be huge, especially living in a part of the state that doesn't really have public transportation and in a town that does not have cheap property. So I'm very, I speak very highly of the purpose of this funding and hope that, people will rush to support it out of concern for addressing inequalities.
Yes. Anyone else want to speak or questions on this?
I would just say, I think it was a mistake on a lot of our parts to not take advantage of the audience we had earlier to point this out, that this was coming up later on in the conversation. And because Davis is absolutely right that we're taking these steps to make this town affordable for others and to stop othering others, right? Get rid of the word other. So I just wish we had kind of pointed this out, and maybe people would have held on to listen to the end of this.
It's a good point, Jamie.
Agreed, thank you.
I would agree that, and I would hope that, to be fair though, I would hope that they had read the warrant articles ahead of time and knew that this was something that was going to be part of the conversation, so that if there was an interest to stay in there, then they would have. But I also appreciate all the incredible questions that we got tonight and all the sustained interest and engagement that we've had. So having said that, lost my page. I need to move to a motion if there's no other comments or questions.
Stebbins, so moved.
Second.
Healy, second.
And DePietro.
Yes, DePietro.
Healy.
Healy, yes.
Burville.
Burville, yes.
Stebbins.
Stebbins, yes.
Stacy.
Stacy, yes.
Melio.
Melio, yes.
Famosi.
Famosi, yes to recommend.
And myself, I am a yes to recommend. All right. Thank you, everyone. The last article is to transact any other business that may legally come before said meeting. I would say the only thing that I have is a short announcement here. There's nothing pressing that I know of or that I've thought of up to this point, is that obviously with town meeting coming up on June 22nd, to remind the committee that there probably will be a need, almost guaranteed a need for a meeting on that same day, probably slightly earlier than the start time of the meeting itself, to go over the few placeholders if needed, as well as Warrant Article 7, which is the actual the budget itself. Just do me a favor and pencil that in, really pen it into your calendar for now, so we can make sure to be prepared for a slightly earlier discussion on that. And then, is there anything, given the opportunity, given the opportunity to speak to it, is there anything we want to mention as far as you sort of spoke to it earlier, Connor, but as far as the plan for town meeting, given the current COVID crisis?
I'm sorry, I got distracted.
It's okay. I was asking, is there anything you want to share? It's been 4 hours. Is there anything you want to share as far as informing people about the upcoming town meeting, as far as, attending, safety measures, things like that? You did a decent job of obviously bringing it up before. I just wanted to reiterate it here, just as it's part of the last thing I wanted to talk about.
Sure. Town meeting is June 22nd, Monday at 7 p.m. at Stonehill at the Ames Sports Complex. All registered voters can attend and participate. You can check your voter registration status online. You go to our website, go to the town clerk's page, make sure you're registered. We will have significant health safety measures in place to make sure folks can keep their distance and that they hopefully have their masks on, so everyone can feel safe and comfortable participating. We are likely to have a virtual pre-town meeting next week, probably Wednesday, that we'll publish and make people able to come to, where they can talk about warrant articles in a more kind of mock town meeting way. Some of the questions about procedure and how things work, we could talk about that there, so folks can feel informed going into town meeting. And we'll publish the Know Before You Go guide with a map of Stonehill's campus for folks who haven't gone there. Where do they park? How do they get to this place and participate? So all that will be in the coming week. The select board, the warrant will be published. I mean, the drafts are online, the official warrant will be published after tonight. And the select board are meeting Monday, the 15th, hopefully, sorry, dropped my pen, for a balanced budget discussion at that point. And that's where we're at. So.
Thank you, Connor. Anything else from anyone else in the committee or anyone else from a question standpoint from an attendee? Yes, Tim.
I just want to say thank you for everyone coming out tonight. I know it was a long night. I also wanted to thank all the attendees who were there tonight and at the other meetings. And I did have one last thank you, and that's out to my wife, who it's our anniversary tonight. She was kind enough to let me spend 4 hours at a finance committee meeting addressing.
Dear God, Tim, that's above and beyond.
Just a special thank you.
And we all
Happy,
thank you.
happy anniversary.
Happy
anniversary.
Congratulations.
Woo. How many years, Tim?
Today is 20.
Boom,
Oh
look at
my
that.
Gosh.
Come on. No, it's not like you can go to a restaurant. So
We owe you.
Alive.
Well, Tim, thank you for being here. I appreciate it. That's amazing. Anything else from anybody else? Then I have one more motion to ask for.
Healy, motion to adjourn.
Can I get a second?
Stacy second.
DePietro,
Petrie, yes.
Healy,
Healy, yes.
Burville,
Burville, yes.
Stebbins,
Stebbins, yes.
Stacy,
Stacy, yes.
Camelio,
Camelio, yes.
Mimosi,
Mostly yes.
and Patrick. Helen, yes. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate all the time and effort. Thank you to Tom again. And thank you very much, Connor and Wendy, for all the amazing information that you gave us.
Yeah, thank you.
Good night, all.